If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. People who believe they have seen cryptids, unknown beings, or other strange creatures that shouldn't exist, such as crawlers, skinwalkers, Sasquatch, Wendigo, etc., please share your story. I recently moved from North Carolina to Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, for work. It's truly beautiful here, and the lush green, mossy forests of the PNW are definitely something else. You have trails, woods, and parks everywhere here, so it's no surprise that there was a huge old-growth tree area 2 minutes away from my house. After a couple of weeks of settling in, it became a routine to walk my dog in these woods daily. I mean, at least until 2 days ago, on January 23rd. I went for a walk with my dog fairly early in the morning, right after the sun rose. It was a typical walk for me until my dog, who always loves to walk in these woods, didn't move. It just stood still and barked towards a tree. As much as I tried to get him to move, he's a big dog, and it's hard to control him when he doesn't obey. At first, I thought it must have been a squirrel or a bird, but then I heard laughter coming from that direction. As far as I could see, there were no other humans nearby, and then I saw it. A little human-looking being quickly sprints through some ferns. No taller than 10 to 12 inches, it seems pale green, a sort of moldish color. As far as I'm aware, it had some hair and ran very fast, and I didn't manage to get a photo of it or observe many details as my dog's loud barking got distracting. After this, I didn't stay to investigate and quickly walked back home, and luckily my dog followed along. I no longer feel safe in those woods, and if anyone knows what that could have been, help is really appreciated. I know what I saw. I assume I'm going to be called delusional, but I guess I'd most likely say the same if someone told me this. I've always been skeptical. Ghosts, aliens, monsters, they were all just stories to me. But after what I experienced in the Southwest, my perspective on the unknown has been forever altered. I was on a road trip with my best friend, Jake. We had decided to take a detour through the Navajo reservation in Arizona, mainly because of the scenic beauty and the rich history of the area. We had heard tales of skinwalkers, but we laughed them off. They were just myths, right? Our first day on the reservation was uneventful. We visited a few local spots, interacted with some of the locals, and set up camp near a canyon. As night fell, we sat around our campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the serenity of the desert. Around midnight, Jake decided to turn in. I stayed up, mesmerized by the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, and I felt a profound sense of peace. That is, until I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the canyon. I froze, thinking it might be a coyote or a mountain lion. But then, I heard a voice. It was distorted, as if someone were speaking through a broken radio, but it was unmistakably Jake's voice. "Come here," it beckoned. Confused, I turned to our tent. Jake was sound asleep. The voice called out again, this time from the opposite direction. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the source. What I saw will haunt me forever. Standing on a ridge was a figure. It looked like a man, but its limbs were elongated, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. It wore tattered clothing, and its skin was a mottled gray. But the most disturbing part was its face. It was Jake's face. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The creature mimicked Jake's voice again, "Come here." It took a step toward me, its movements were jerky and unnatural. I bolted to the tent, shaking Jake awake. "We need to go. Now," I hissed. He looked at me, confused, but the urgency in my voice spurred him into action. We packed up as quickly as we could, the creature's voice echoing around us, mimicking our voices, our laughter, and our conversations from earlier. As we sped away in our car, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature stood in the middle of the road, watching us, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We checked into a motel, and I spent the night researching skinwalkers. The legends said they were witches who could take the form of animals or people, using their voices to lure victims. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I do know one thing: the stories are real. The Southwest is beautiful, but it holds secrets that are beyond comprehension. And I'll never set foot on the Navajo reservation again. To all of you listening to this, please be careful when you venture into unknown territories. Some legends are rooted in truth, and some nightmares are very, very real. I live in Northeast Ohio, and my house is directly in front of about 200 to 300 acres of woods. I used to explore it all the time. I had a strange encounter about 2 years ago when I was making a trip through a part of the woods I'd been in at least 100 times. I've always had a thing for the outdoors, so I was pretty familiar with that part of it. It was me and my cousin, who is only a year younger than I am, and we both just had knives and little bullshit we like to mess with in the woods. It was the middle of the day, and we heard coyotes yipping only about 20 to 30 yards out. So I made me and him climb a tree to avoid them because the coyotes around here are mean and we weren't properly armed. We climbed the tree and watched the pack run past, not too far away. They seemed panicked, like they were running from something, so I watched closely as my cousin covered his eyes because he was scared. Then something large ran behind the pack. It looked like a large dog, but it was impossibly large, like the size of a small black bear. It was jet black except for its eyes. They were a weird shade of green, but, TBH, I'm not 100% sure, I didn't get a great look. I asked my cousin about it later, but he didn't see any of it. It didn't seem super strange until I started reading into stuff like this, and I was curious if it lined up with anything else or if I just saw the world's biggest dog. Almost 5 years ago, I was fishing at my grandma's pasture, several hundred acres in the south-central Kansas area. Where I was fishing, there is a small dam and waterfall in a fairly wooded area. It was just getting dark. I had walked the creek, and my vehicle was a good mile away. I was almost finished when I hooked a decent bass. I brought it in, and as I was throwing him back, something caught my eye across the creek, a creature. It stood only 4 feet tall at its maximum. It was gray and pale and almost looked sickly. The best way I can describe it was like a hairless cat head and skin but like a skinny yet impressive human-like body. The creature was looking directly at me, like I ducked up and shouldn't be seeing him. His head rocked side to side, almost like it was dancing. I slowly reached for my fillet knife, making sure not to take my eyes off of it. I did feel threatened by whatever this was. I get my knife in hand, and it lets out a sound that I have never heard before, and I hope to never hear it again. It was loud and extremely high-pitched and took off into the woods. I have never seen that again, but others have told me about the lights they see down there, but I didn't share my story for fear of ridicule. I now carry a gun with me when I fish. I recently saw a post online by a journalist talking about 2 boys who saw a creature in the county next to the one my family lives in. It got me thinking about a story that happened to my aunt before I was born. My aunt had told me and anyone else that asked this story, and no matter what, her story never changed. She stood on what she saw as real, even if no one believed her. One night, she and her boyfriend were driving down the road and were coming up on a railroad track. When they got closer, they saw an 8-foot-tall creature standing on the side of the road. I always remembered her saying she had glowing eyes. Weirdly enough, she always thought it had kind of smirked at her when they drove past. It didn't chase them, try, or do anything. It just stood there, staring and watching them as they drove past. She had always described it as looking like a werewolf. This was before she married my uncle, and I think that experience of hers brought them closer because he had an experience of his own as a child. When he was a kid, he was walking home. At this time, he lived in the country. I'm talking about maybe 200 people who live in this area. I also used to live here, just so you can get an idea of how he felt being the only person outside at this time. He also saw an 8-foot-tall creature that scared him to death. He ran all the way home and busted through the door. He told my grandma what he had seen, and I'm not sure if my grandma believed him or not at the time. I asked her when I got older, and she said he was so terrified that whether she saw it or not, he still saw something that scared him that badly. A few years ago, my uncle started getting into listening to scary stories when he came across the Dogman. He has listened to every type of cryptid story, and the Dogman is the only one he wholeheartedly believes is true. I live on the countryside of Scotland, and I'm a 23-year-old guy. My encounter happened only a few nights ago, and I am still mentally processing what I saw in the forest. I was taking my dog Brody out for his midnight walk, and our walk path cuts through a section of forest close to my house. Usually nothing happens, and Brody just does what he does, and then we go home, yet tonight Brody didn't act at all himself. A few things you need to know about my dog before I continue on. He is a mix between Border Collie and a German Shepherd. He is 4 feet tall, he is also a quiet dog, and he would only break silence if he was spooked. So we were just walking along the path when suddenly Brody stopped mid-step and put his nose to the air. Then I saw his fur bristle and heard his deep growling as he started looking in all directions. Logically, I thought maybe a field mouse or even a stray deer was passing through, so I kneeled down in front of him and tried calming him down. His response was to spin around and start barking at where we had been walking. I got this warm sensation coming from my chest, as if someone had lit a fire under my skin. Sweat began breaking out across my forehead. Then I saw what Brody must have been spooked by. At first glance, I thought what I was looking at was a dog. I breathed in a sigh and silently scolded Brody for freaking out at it. Then I get back up and I glance a second time. I realized what I was looking at was not a dog, It was a black-coated wolf and it was as tall as a Yorkshire horse. Every story that my gran used to tell me as a child about the werewolves came flooding back to me and I went limp from fear and fell to my knees. I kept my eyes on it but I gripped Brody's collar. I didn't want him to try attacking it and getting himself killed. I would rather have him by my side and die together. This werewolf had been in a stare down with my dog all this time and only when I had fallen to my knees did it take notice of me. Its glowing gold eyes blinked and it started to slowly approach us. I glanced at Brody. He suddenly turned from growling to being submissive as he laid down and rolled over. I let go of his collar and gulped in loudly, and I looked up. Its own face was inches away from mine. The werewolf kept staring into my face, as if it could somehow see into my soul. It growled, and the sound vibrated through the ground and into my body. I looked down and showed it the back of my neck, then closed my eyes tight and waited for its teeth. After what felt like eternity to me but must have only been moments, I glanced back up. A part of me wanted to see it again. And it was gone. Only I knew I hadn't imagined it because what I heard next was its howling. I pulled myself up off the ground, and Brody did the same, and we took off running towards home. I have now changed our walking route because of this experience and avoid the forests on full moon nights. I walk on train tracks near my property for walnuts, and at times I pick up deer skeletons to make bone meal. One day this year, I was walking, and I got this heart-stopping fear that surged through me, which stopped me in my tracks. I decided to stop to see what could have caused that sort of response. I didn't see it at first, but ahead of me, sitting next to the tracks, was an extremely thin but tall humanoid creature. It had its back partially toward me, but it was doing something with its arm. I stepped as quietly as possible off the tracks and into a drainage ditch so I could back out without being seen. When I did, I saw it poking at a dead deer with sickeningly long fingers. I've no idea what it was, but I got the hell out of there. I've decided it was a hallucination, because if it wasn't, I would be selling my home and moving far away. Any ideas? A few nights ago, my friends and I were just hanging around driving when one of them suggested we go to the park and watch the sunset over the lake. We got to the park at around 7:15, and we ended up making our way to the trail that led to the lake. My friend Ted ended up talking about cryptids and other shit and said we might encounter something at the park, as we were on native land. My friend Ted then indicated that there was something ahead of us, and we called his bluff and laughed at him. He then brought up a video of a sound effect of the goat man trying to scare us. My other friend Alex said it sounded like a skinwalker, and as you know, when you're on native land, you can't say that name out loud. Just to clarify, there was no one on the path except my friends and me. 2 minutes after he said that name, I looked behind us, and we saw we were being followed by something. It was tall, skinny, and moving very slowly towards us. I said under my breath, "OSHT," and my friends turned around and saw whatever I was looking at. I said to them that we should pick up the pace a bit, as it seemed a little weird that this thing came out of nowhere. We saw no indication of anything, no footsteps or rustling in the woods, and my friends said to me that once this thing appeared, they smelled something putrid, which in Native American lore means if you smell something putrid or disgusting, that's a sign a skinwalker is on your tail. So we ended up running as fast as we could down the trail to try and lose it. When we turned around, it was still moving at the same pace, very slowly. Thinking that we were safe, we started to walk at a normal speed. We were also close to a road with a bunch of cars roaring past us. Me being curious, I looked behind us to see if the coast was clear, and to my horror, I saw that the thing caught up to us. It was now at least 100 feet away, making no sound as it moved, and we were horrified to see that it had no face. My friends and I decided it was a good idea to bolt as fast as we could back to my car. When we got back to the parking lot, I saw that the only car that was left was my car, and whatever that thing was that was following us was horrifyingly real. A day later, I was walking my dogs around my house, and I saw a cat come out of the woods and start walking towards me. Knowing that skinwalkers can take any form, I went back inside, not taking any chances. A few hours later, I picked up my friend Ted, and we originally were going to go back to my house and play video games, but as soon as we got to my house, he said he felt dread, so we ended up just driving around a bunch. Today, he ended up telling me that whatever he saw at the park, he saw at my house, giving the same description as what we saw at the park. He said it was tall, skinny, and had no face, describing the same thing that we saw at the park. At the time this occurred, about 3 years ago, my dad's place was located very near my work, so I would travel down this particular stretch of road pretty much every day. It was a well-lit road leading into the downtown area of a small city, and the river lay on my right, going to my dad's house this particular evening, wending along, dotted by some rather nice properties. I had been driving along, actually singing along to an old song on the radio. I was in fine spirits, going to see my dad, and while the road wasn't deserted, there were few cars along it at the time. All of a sudden, stopping me cold, I felt this wave of emotions crash over me: fear, grief, and a desire to scream, slamming into me like a physical car crash. Time seemed to slow for a moment, the way it does during a surge of adrenaline, and I saw, not 3 feet from my right wheel, something tall, impossibly thin, and absolutely dark. But it moved. It turned, and I caught just the slightest glimpse of something, a face. I could make out what looked like a beak, short and bent, protruding from beneath a hood. And a word, for a millisecond, rang in my head loudly, more like a title than a feeling. Dread. I continued to watch, time still stretched thin, as I passed it, my passenger side mirror coming dangerously close. And as I turned to get a better glance, it was gone. The street lamps hadn't altered once, they had shone right where I saw them. I ran the details over and over in my mind and actually turned the car around to examine the spot. My heart was pounding, and I had to turn off the radio. I was covered in goose pimples. But there was nothing there, no tree, post, or any other viable explanation, to account for what I saw. It felt as real as anything I've ever felt. It felt as though, for a brief moment, another consciousness touched mine to make its presence known. And it felt old. When I was 21, I decided to go out with a bunch of friends in the woods, and we would hang out after dark. Now we all had booze, we had flashlights, 2 of us had guns, and I had my knife on me. The walk was pretty long through the woods to get to a cliff that had a beautiful view of the sunset, and we were just going to drink and get high, nothing too major, just some weed. We got to the spot no problem, and at the top of this cliff, there was a huge rock that you could stand behind and nobody would see you. So we sat on the cliff and went back to the rock and the forest behind it. One of my buddies, let's call him Jeff, got up and said he had to take a piss. We told her to be careful as it's getting dark and there are cougars and bears in the woods, so I told him to hurry up and be quick, and if anything happens, just holler. So he goes behind the rock, and we could hear him start to do his business. We were all just sitting there smoking and drinking when, all of a sudden, we heard this loud, almost ear-piercing shriek. We all thought it was a mountain lion, so we went to check on Jeff, and he was standing there with his pants down around his ankles. He has this bewildered look on his face, and he looks white as a ghost. It's almost like he saw one. We're looking around, and we notice that there's this huge gaping hole in the forest towards where we could hear something running away. This hole was easily 7 or 8 feet tall and about 3 or 4 people across. It was huge. There is no way a bear or a cougar could have made a hole like that, and the sounds of the thing running away almost sounded like Bigfoot was running away. In the area where I lived, we had tales of the Mogollon monster, which is basically Bigfoot in a sense. This creature is 7 or 8 feet tall and very big, and no one has really ever gotten a good look or picture of him. We don't know what happened that night, as Jeff refuses to talk about it, and we don't know what he saw. Some of us chased after it with guns, but it was much quicker, and it got away. Because we don't know what it was, what happened, or what Jeff saw, we can only assume that something else was out there last night that scared the bejesus out of this big man, who since that night hasn't gone in the woods. This happened a year ago, and I still haven't told many people about it because it still shakes me to my core. I was home with my dad. We live on the outside of town near miles of deep, dark forests. It was around 11 p.m. My dad had gone to bed, but I sat out in the living room, watching a movie and pigging out on some food. I got up and walked down to the restroom. While waking up in the hallway, I noticed that outside was really quiet there, where no coyotes were howling and our cows weren't mooing. I thought it was strange, but quickly forgot. I did my business in the restroom, and while I was washing my hands, I looked out the window to my right, which is about 7 to 8 feet off the ground. I saw what I thought was a face. It looked pale and like half of its face was gone or was rotting. Of course, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then the motion sensor light turned on, and I saw it in all of its ugly and scary glory. I looked at it, and while it looked at me, I stood there, staring at it. I stood like that for so long, it could have been minutes or an hour. Just as I thought it couldn't get worse, the thing moved and took off, running into the woods. I stood there for a while longer before I moved again. I ran and told my dad. He didn't think much of it, but he got up and went outside to check, and I went and grabbed a shotgun. Luckily, the thing was gone. I haven't seen it since, but one thing is for sure, I will never stay home alone or stay up late again. So I live in a rural town in Australia, and I'm used to seeing kangaroos and hares when I go for walks alone. It was a Saturday, and I went for a walk on this trail I had found that is 30 to 40 minutes away from my house. The trail follows a bike track until you reach the fork in the track. If you leave, you end up back at the beginning of the track, and if you head right, You follow this trail, which is very narrow. You can't properly fit two people walking side by side. So I continue down this track, and usually I hear birds chirping and just the general wildlife noises, but I couldn't hear a single noise but the wind blowing the trees around and the crunching of gravel under my shoes, so I continue my walk for another 10 to 20 minutes when I start to pick up on leaves crunching behind me as if something or someone is trailing me. I thought nothing of this and kept walking for what seemed like a while when I heard a massive tree crack, as if someone or something stepped on a large tree branch and broke it directly in half. This caused me to stop and jump back as I started scanning the tree line for whatever made that loud noise when I saw a black figure duck behind a few trees, maybe 100 to 200 meters away. Now I knew this wasn't a kangaroo by the size of the figure. It's hard to describe, but I will do my best. Its arms were abnormally long, they stretched from its shoulder to the ground, and its head was tilted nearly 90 degrees sideways, almost as if its head wasn't connected to its body. As I saw this figure duck behind the thick trees and shrubs, I stood there, staring at where I last saw the figure. What really scares me and is engraved in my mind is its eyes peeking through the bushes, those dark red eyes that felt like they stared into my soul as if I were their helpless prey and they were the apex predator. When I saw this, my whole body became afraid. All my joints were shaking, and this eerie fear washed over me as my body took off running before my brain could comprehend what I had just seen. As I was sprinting away, I could hear leaves and branches cracking loudly as if I were getting chased by something large and fast. I never looked back as I was chased for what seemed like ages, my blood coursing through my veins and my adrenaline at an all-time high. The most high-pitched screeching like a humanoid figure with its vocal cords cut. I heard this screeching and immediately dove behind this big mound of dirt, about 30 meters away from me, as I sat there trying to restrain my breathing so as not to give my position away. When I heard the sound of leaves cracking coming from the other side of the mound, I sat there holding my breath when I heard the thing bolt past me at such incredible speed that I was shocked that it hadn't caught me earlier. As I sat there for what seemed like hours, waiting for this thing to return, it started getting dark. I knew I had to move, or otherwise it would be pitch black and I would have to use my phone flashlight to navigate, and with that thing lurking around, I knew I was a dead man. I nervously got up and sprinted back to town. The rest of the day was normal, and I have never heard or seen that thing ever. I still refuse to go down that trail, as I have never been that fearful for my life. I am grateful that I hit at that fork, otherwise, I might not be typing this here. I was driving alone in a national park, very far from people, on a bright full moon night. Huge, clear moon, the kind of moonlight you can read by. The road went straight along the bottom of a wide, flat, mostly barren valley, then banked up and sharply left onto the ridge. It was about 10 p.m., and I drove through the valley on full alert, watching for animals and loving the scenery in the crazy bright moonlight. When I hit the curve and went into that sharp uphill left, I saw something through my side window. White thing. It was rapidly getting larger in my peripheral vision, as though it had been moving parallel to me, but the turn in the road meant I was now in its path. So I turned my head and looked directly. It was white. Man-shaped but without genitals and naked. A deathly, nauseating white with a greasy shine, completely hairless. It was crawling on its hands and knees, but it was half the size of the car, and it was coming so very, very fast. It had a rubbery face, distorted by hate or a scream, and black eyes that reflected the moonlight. The look on its face, I can't even tell you, I can still make myself feel sick from the memory. I believed that it was intelligent and that it wanted to tear me apart with its teeth. The speed was horrifying. It went from being a small white spot to spitting distance in the time it took to make that turn. When I unfroze myself and hit the gas, it was on the road, and I braced for it to run into my car door. And then it was gone. The rearview mirror showed me nothing. I have never told anyone. I have seen a few minor glitchy or ghostly things over my many years, but nothing has ever frightened me like that. It was looking at me. And I don't know what it was. I can't seem to find any reference to anything like it, and I would like to know if this thing is known in folklore. This story isn't mine, but that of one of my good friends. And I've never seen her this shaken while telling me a story. She is the most genuine and open person I know, so when she told me this story, I believed every word. I don't want to use her real name, so I'll call her Jen. Jen and I like to talk about anything and everything when we reconnect, but one thing we love to talk about is spirits and the supernatural. I'm a Native American, so stories about skinwalkers or similar supernatural beings aren't alien to me. I even have my own stories. Jen likes to go to open fields on the nights of full moons. We've done it together a few times, and it's an amazing surreal experience. But one night she went with her other friend, whom we will call Jessica. She and Jessica went to an open field and started walking through it, but this was different than the other nights. Jen felt off. She thought she was hearing twigs snap behind them. She has bipolar disorder, so she thought it was just in her head. But she was overwhelmed with this feeling that she couldn't explain. She just felt on edge, like she was being watched. They continue to walk, and they stop in the middle of the field. Jen starts looking around, and if you have ever been in the middle of the woods with a full moon out, you know just how it can light up everything. She saw something, and she bolted, not saying a word. She left Jessica behind, but Jessica was quick to react and followed behind. They get to the car, and Jen locks the doors, and she rips out of there. Jen was hysterical, crying and yelling, "Did you see that?" over and over to Jessica. Jessica didn't see it, but she felt the same way Jen did, and she heard what she heard. Jen saw something that shook her to her core. As she was looking around, she heard a branch snap and looked over. About 9 feet off the ground, peeking around a tree, she saw a white, pale face. I'll explain to you how she explained it to me. She said it was like looking into the husk of a humanoid, no emotion, no life, the eyes were non-existent and only had a few strands of what looked like hair. She couldn't see if it had a mouth, but she said where the mouth was supposed to be, there was a red stain, what she believes to be blood. As she told me this story, she trembled and cried. I've never seen her that way. I trust her with my whole being, so I trust every word she says. I had to comfort her and calm her down after she told me this. She still sees that face in her dreams some nights. I hope she recovers from this experience, but when you experience something like this, it'll stick with you forever. A few years ago, during my 3rd year of university, I was hanging out with my 2 best friends late at night, bumming around our quiet town. I had an online assignment due that night, but instead of doing it myself, I got my mom to help me out since she had done a similar course when she was in university, and I was being a lazy, irresponsible young adult. I was on the phone giving my login details to my mom to do my assignment when one of my friends suggested we go for a night walk through this cemetery that is behind a well-known restaurant located in the center of our town that sits up on a hill. So we started walking up the road to the cemetery entrance when my friends ran off ahead of me, turning their phone lights off and hiding in an attempt to scare me. It didn't work, but it was a good laugh, and we continued into the cemetery. We didn't really have an idea of where we were heading, so we just started heading towards the far end of the cemetery by walking directly through the gravestones. All the gravestones in this cemetery are of the flat kind, so we were walking over graves in the pitch dark with only a couple of phone flashlights illuminating the 10 or so feet in front of us. I'm tailing behind my 2 friends by about 5-ish feet since I'm still on my phone with my mom, and the only thing I'm looking at is their outline from the phone flashlights. We were just about halfway through the cemetery when my 2 friends stopped in their tracks and, without saying a word, turned around and ran in a dead sprint. Thinking they're trying to scare me a second time, I follow with a light, run after them, and catch up to them back towards the entrance of the cemetery, which is illuminated by the nearby street lights. They're both out of breath, doubled over, with a legitimate look of fear in their eyes. Apparently they saw some sort of slender humanoid creature that was initially hunched over with its back turned to them, but after the light revealed it, it stood straight up on 2 legs and turned around, roughly 6 to 8 feet tall, and glared at them. Did you see that thing? With the burning red eyes? And the long, razor-sharp claws? Yeah. And the face. It was like a snout. But not like a bear. They were finishing each other's sentences without hesitation. Either it was a perfectly crafted lie while I was distracted, or they saw something that night. My one friend swears by it to this day without a detail out of place, and this happened about 7 years ago. They've pulled other pranks in the past, but never this well thought out or drawn out. A few other details. If I remember correctly, I may have mentioned a full moon before entering the cemetery. This was sometime in late October or early November as well. So what did they see? Werewolf? Wendigo? Skinwalker? Something else? It was definitely too big to be a raccoon, and they said it was too thin for a bear. Also, we don't hear of bear sightings around our area anyway, we haven't been back since, and it bugs me to this day. I'd like to go again some night. Film the experience and see if we catch this creature on camera. I was driving home from San Antonio late at night or early in the morning last year. 2 or 3 a.m. I live out in the boonies in Edinburgh. Lots of trees, very dark. So I pull up, and I'm having a smoke outside before I head in, and I'm not kidding, I hear a whistle. Like someone calling a dog, almost, but weird. Kind of broken up. If you've ever seen the main villain in the movie Us, you know what I'm talking about. Whatever. It's late, I'm tired, and I figure, nah, I'm just freaking out over nothing. I hear it again, but this time I hear someone saying, come over here. I consider myself a brave bee, so I pull out my flashlight on my phone and shine it toward the trees. Nothing. I start to nope out of there. I'm grabbing my bags, and a black dog comes out from the trees and sits at the tree line. I head in, turn on all my lights, and my dogs are going insane because since I turned on the outside light also, they can see this black dog. I corral them into my room, I pretend everything is chill, and I shower. Come out, I'm going to grab a bottle of water. Guess who is right outside the glass door? Yup. Black dog. Staring. Needless to say, I locked myself and the dogs inside my room and got no sleep. The dog was gone the next morning. I moved not too long after. My experience happened maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I lived in a small college town right on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. My 2 friends Blake, Eric, and I had a couple drinks at my place, and we decided to go to the park near the middle of town to go for a walk. I would say the time was around 1 to 2 a.m. Blake had just seen an episode of The Office where everyone was doing hardcore parkour around the office, and we had previously been joking and laughing about it, so as we parked in the parking lot, he hopped out and started off on his parkour run. Eric and I ran after him, laughing, and when we finally caught up to him, we slowed down and started walking the path. We neared the northern part of the path where it starts turning right to go back around the park. On the outer side of the path, there was a clearing in the trees on the hill leading down to the river below, covered in a foot or two of brush. We debated heading down to the river, and as we got to the edge of the path, we saw it. The joking immediately halted as we stood frozen for a few seconds as our eyes adjusted to the darkness. About 20 feet down the hill, this thing was hunched over, facing away from us. It must have heard us and turned its head to look toward us. From what I remember of the second or two I saw of its face, it had an almost wolf-looking face, and its eyes were terrifying. It continued to turn towards us while standing upright on its hind legs, and immediate fear overcame me. I knew right away that whatever this thing was, it did not look friendly and was like nothing I had ever seen before. All 3 of us absolutely lost it and ran to Eric's car as fast as we possibly could. I don't think any of us looked back even once until we got into the car. We asked each other what the duck that thing was, and not a single one of us had even close to the slightest explanation as to what we saw. I stumbled upon an old scary story book at our library, and there was an old story from western Wisconsin about the Wendigo. And that was the closest explanation to what I saw that I came across. Searching for a Wendigo on Google, I find very similar characteristics within the top illustrations. So I, female, 19, was out with my boyfriend and a few friends driving around town, Gympie, on a Friday night about a year ago. We stopped in at a house party, but it was full of 12 hammered-on goons. Gross. So we decided to head out to a lookout or something like that. My friend Taylor suggested we go see if we can find the glowing cross, a local legend that is actually true and creepy as duck. So we drive about 15 minutes out of town until we reach a dirt road that starts through paddocks, farms, and stuff. We literally saw like 30 tawny frogmouth owls, not owls. It was insane. I honestly think they're like my spirit animal or something, and they were there to protect me. I don't know, but probs. Anyway, so we're driving down this dirt road, and we cross creeks and stuff. Then it turns into a forest, like we hadn't seen streetlights for over half an hour by this point, and it was super dark and scary. I honestly don't know why we thought this was a good idea. Then we saw it. The cross was glowing super brightly up in the trees over 100 meters away. We got super freaked out, and my boyfriend was teasing us by slowly getting closer while we screamed for him to stop. When we finally did get close to it, it wasn't so impressive. It was literally just like a painted wooden cross nailed to a tree high up with like reflector paint for road sides. Still, who climbed the big gum tree to put it up there? A creep, that's who. Then, for some stupid reason, the boys started to talk about all the cult rumors. There's actually an unhealthy amount in this area. Super ducking strange. Anyway, so after like a minute of sitting in the darkness with that conversation, Taylor and I begged to leave. So my boyfriend turned the car around to head back to civilization. Now, I kid you not, as we were driving back down this road, we literally just came down. There was a massive branch across the road near the creek. What the duck? After fighting about who was going to get out of the car to move it, we decided it was safest if we all went together. Obviously. Never stray from the group. That's just asking to get yourself in trouble in situations like this. And lucky. When we had finished moving it off the road, another branch fell from above on the other side of the car. At this point, we all huddled together and were, actually, hysterical. I mean, we were screaming but laughing at the same time. I don't know, we thought we were going to die, but it was also super hilarious for some reason. Then we heard something loudly jumping through the treetops, snapping branches as it went. We all screamed, and this time there was no laughing. I was at about 11/10, freaked out. Whatever it was big, not normal size animal sized, so we jumped back into the car, all over the top of each other. Then my boyfriend began to drive, and as we crossed this creek, this branch flew from the trees and hit the side of the car. It wasn't just a branch, it was a branch completely covered in leaves. Like a fresh branch. Anyway, my boyfriend sped down that road super fast, and we got out of there. We told everyone we saw a yowie, but everyone thinks we're lying, but duck them. I mean, if I didn't see it, I probably wouldn't believe us either, but still, why would I lie about that? It's stupid. On our weekend drives, we avoid that side of town because, no thanks. This was maybe 2 years ago or so, and it still bothers me. I've only ever told one person about what I saw because it scared me absolutely shitless, and I was worried if I told people something bad might happen to me. But it's been 2 years now, and I've never seen it again, so I'll share. I live in rural Ohio. Think of cornfields, a small town, and no neighbors nearby to hear you scream. I was driving home from work late at night, close to 11 p.m. As I was driving, there was this thing running on the road. It was running on the opposite side of the road, heading in the same direction as I was. I've never seen anything like it. Running on all fours, but not like a dog or cat, almost like a person. It was large, maybe the size of my Great Pyrenees, and hauling ass. It looked like it was fairly hairless and fleshy. I've seen coyotes and dogs with mange. I don't think it was that because the running was off and the back knees weren't backward facing. I did not stop. I floored that shit and got as far away as I could. I just remember that my heart was pounding and I was shaking. It didn't turn back to look at me as I was approaching, and I didn't want it to either, so I have no idea what its head or face looked like. Regardless, it scared me so bad that I never took that route home again and never talked about it with anyone besides my husband. I still have nightmares about it. I don't know if it was my fight or flight kicking in, but I felt like I was in danger. I live in South Wales, UK. Now, admittedly, we aren't known for our cryptids, more known for ghosts, which I don't believe in. I'm a 30M. I live in a remote area, and in the past, I've hunted and eaten rabbits. I no longer do this, as I can't hurt animals anymore. The largest, native, animal we have is the red deer. But, for many years, there have been news articles of large cats in our area, possibly puma or panther, that have grown too large for their owners. I live in an area close to Tonmer, South Wales, and there is a creature sighted frequently called the Beast of Tonmer. A police officer who was a close friend of my family told of an encounter with said beast. However, the creature I encountered that day, when I was 11 years old, was neither a large cat nor a red deer. I had been playing with my cousins. As children who lived in the valley, exploring the trees, forests, rivers, and valleys was the norm. My cousin, who lived barely 2 miles from my house, had asked me to go for a walk and explore, as our parents, related in some distant ways, sat, spoke, and ate. My cousin was a lot thinner and more agile than me. While exploring the forests, barely a mile from his home, I had lost sight of him rather quickly. I'm not sure what made me turn to my right. I heard no sound or caught a glimpse in the corner of my eye, but I turned and glanced. There is a tree line, maybe 20 feet from me. There was a creature I could only explain as a dog that was bipedal. Werewolf isn't the word, this was, sure as day, a dog. It was leaning against a tree, using one paw to steady itself. As I looked at it, as we became aware of one another, the creature pushed off from the tree and stood in a way that was terrifying and threatening at the same time, a stance I knew immediately as aggressive, though I can't say why. It was run away or die, even at 11 years old, I knew that. I ran with tears streaming all the way back to my cousin's home. When my younger cousins returned, they scolded me for my imagination getting the better of me. I know what I saw that day. I'm 31 now, and I'll remember the sheer helplessness I felt in the presence of that creature for the rest of my life. This is still hard for me to wrap my head around because it shook me to my core, but this story takes place just over a year ago, in late November 2018. I live in a rural suburb in southeast Wisconsin, near a line of woods and ponds. My town is small, and everything is silent and dark by 9 p.m. I tend to walk my dog after dinner and before bed, and my town is pretty safe, so walking her in the dark never fazed me. Until this. I live in an apartment complex that is on the end of a residential street, so most of the street is older houses. One night I was walking my dog, around 10:30 p.m., I think, when I saw something on the front lawn of one of these houses. They didn't have a light on their front porch, so most of their lawn was dark, but with lights from the surrounding houses, I could see a figure standing in the middle of their lawn. It was very tall and skinny, almost as tall as the roof of their ranch house, because even standing in the middle of the front yard, it looked almost as tall as the house. It was standing on its hind legs but had antlers or some type of tall ears like a bunny, and its arms and legs were abnormally long and stretched to the bone. The moment I saw it, my body froze, and I had that feeling that you only get when you're near immediate danger or evil. For context, I love the supernatural, paranormal, and true crime. I've lived in a without a doubt haunted house, frequently go on after-hours explorations of known haunted places, and have seen and experienced many paranormal events. That feeling is undeniable once you are familiar with it. So this tall, lanky creature is standing there, and I can't see its face, but by its positioning, I know it has also noticed me. My dog, who is normally aware of every living creature from a mile away in a snowstorm, is completely unaware of its presence. It felt like longer, but it was only a few seconds before this creature jumped straight up in the air, and I mean straight up, not forward, and bound to the back of the house in 3 large strides. It didn't make a sound, and the way it jumped and moved was unlike any animal I've ever seen. The closest I would akin it to would be a deer, but it was on its hind legs and had the body features of a stretched out human but with antlers or tall ears. I felt stuck and almost hypnotized by the whole thing, but came to my senses enough to call attention to my dog and turn around to head home. Behind all of the houses on this side of the street is wood, and some of the trees wrap around between this house and the neighboring house coming back towards home. We turned around, my eyes glued to the trees, and when we got to the middle of the houses, I could see 2 eyes watching me through the 2 houses. The presence and overall weight of the feeling this whole encounter gave me still stick with me as clearly as the night it happened. I can remember it all so vividly and still feel the weight. Ever since that night, I've been thinking about it and running through all of the possibilities of what it could be, but I always come up with no explanation. It wasn't until about a month ago, when I was watching a special on supernatural encounters, that I heard about Wendigos. The description fit perfectly, and it made my blood run even colder. I'm fully convinced that what I saw that night had to have been a Wendigo. I've made a point to only walk my dog during the daylight hours during the summer months, and on the connecting street that is the main road of my town, which is at least lit with streetlights in the winter when it gets dark before I'm even home from work. Since that night, I haven't had any other direct encounter with it, except for one event that I'm not sure is related but elicited the same feeling of being watched and almost felt. Across from my apartment complex, on the same side as the woods and the encounter, there is a small pond surrounded by trees. A few weeks ago, my brother was over, and he was outside smoking when he came in quickly and locked the door behind him. I had mentioned my encounter with him when it first happened, but he shrugged it off like most people I told and likely didn't give it a second thought. He looked shaken and kept looking through the peephole in my door without saying anything. He finally got out that he was outside smoking and heard loud dragging and rustling sounds coming from the wooded pond area. He said he was listening for about a minute and thought he caught a glimpse of something very tall near the tree line. He described it as the sound it would make if someone were dragging a heavy animal or body through rough brush or wood, and he had a feeling of dread and heaviness, like he couldn't look away and was being honed in on by something. Normally I'm the type of person that would go out and look for myself, maybe even going down by the pond to explore and find something, but this case shuts all of that down. There is something viscerally evil about this creature that not even I care to explore further. I've tried telling people in my life about all of this, but, as most people do with this type of stuff, none of them really put any stock in it except my brother now that he's had this experience. I'm of the mind that things beyond our comprehension and everyday scope absolutely do exist, and this is one I won't be messing with or going on adventures to see again. Legends and beliefs exist for a reason, and this is one I don't want to mess with. This happened years ago. I was in, I believe, 7th grade. I am now preparing to start college. I was sharing my room with my little brothers, as well as a bunk bed. I had the top bunk. It was summer, and since it got really stuffy in the room, we would install screen windows. I, being a light sleeper, woke up in the middle of the night to hear a light, rhythmic scratching on the screen and raspy breathing. I rolled onto my stomach and peered over the side of the bed. My pillow was directly across from the window, and I saw exactly what you described. It was extremely pale and had long, thin limbs. No clothing or hair. The face was flat and round, and I couldn't really make out a nose or visible ears. Very thin lips. The eyes were sunken. At the time, I thought they were glowing, but now I believe it was just eye shine. It was lightly scratching on the screen and looking around the room. I never got the feeling that it noticed me as I watched it, though. It wasn't trying to get in, either. It wasn't feverish. It was just making noise. I watched it in silent fear for, I would guess, a minute, but it probably wasn't even that long. Eventually, I crawled backwards down the ladder and into the living room, where I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch. As for the height, it had to have been at least 7 feet tall because it was hunched over at the window, and the window itself is about 5 feet off the ground. There was also another incident a couple of months later, when my family and I went on a camping trip with my Boy Scout troop. One of the kids owned property out in the middle of nowhere. I live in central Illinois, and we set up camp deep into their forest. I woke up in our big family tent and heard the light scratching again. Long and rhythmic on the nylon. I could see impressions of long fingers being made on the wall. I just lay there quietly until it moved away, and I even heard it repeating its process on other tents in the campsite before it wandered off. I didn't say anything until my dad pulled me aside the next morning and said he heard the same thing, which woke him up. One last detail, before we went to sleep in our tents, there was a long, haunting scream from the woods. It sounded like a hybrid of a person and some animal being killed and howling one last sound of pain. Everything fell silent. Everyone just stood there. Keep in mind that these were experienced woodsmen, and they hadn't heard anything like that before in their lives. Fox vocalization is noticeably canid. Mountain lion sounds are distinctly feline. This was entirely unnatural. Okay, so this happened years ago now, probably like 5 or 6 years ago if I had to narrow it down. I lived in a very rural area. If anybody is familiar with North Carolina, I lived in Mount Olive, very close to the county line, leaving Wayne County and going into Duplin. This little house is pretty much surrounded by my woods and fields, and there were a few other houses but not many. It was pretty quiet. One night, I was in the process of getting my dogs back inside the house. They weren't paying much attention, except for one, but she wasn't making a scene or anything. I noticed something sitting down the road, just off the edge of the property I live on. It was small, like it most definitely wasn't tall. It was crouched, almost like it was squatting. I hate how silly it sounds, but the way it was sitting reminded me of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. It was very clearly humanoid. Its skin was so pale that it was as white as paper. Its skin looked tight, like there was no loose or saggy skin at all. It wasn't wearing clothes, and it had no hair at all. It didn't have the same intimate areas as a normal person. Looking at it, you couldn't see what its biological sex was. Its eyes were big. I couldn't see eyeballs or anything, just large black eyes. It hadn't noticed me, so I turned on the porch light. It looked away from the dogs and looked at me. It freaked me out, so I shined my phone flashlight directly at it. I think it didn't like the light because the second I shined a flashlight at it, directly into its face, it took off running, and I haven't seen it since. I haven't seen anything else like it either. I think it was watching my dogs, and I don't think I want to know what would have happened had I not gotten them in the house in time. Does anyone have any ideas of what it could have been? Someone told me it could have been one of the moon-eyed people, but I don't live in the mountains or near Appalachia. I lived 6 hours away from that part of the state, but even now it's just 4 hours instead of 6 with where I currently live. Not knowing what it is has bugged me ever since that night. Moon-eyed people, to my knowledge, wouldn't be in eastern NC. I'm open to any suggestions I could look into and read about. I just wanted to share a sighting of Bigfoot that several locals in my town have had. First, I would like to set the background. This happened in the eastern Kentucky/southern West Virginia area. This community is made up of a very no-nonsense, hard-working group of people. The only things we have to do here are work and spend time outside. That would be hunting, hiking, fishing, four-wheeling, etc. From the time I was a toddler, we were turned loose to entertain ourselves. Homes are built on the hillsides of deep hollows, hollers. We have seen every bird, critter, reptile, and mammal you can think of that is native to our region. Yes, I've even seen a mountain lion and heard them as well. There is a clear difference between a bobcat and a mountain lion. Anyway, I say this just to explain that these people know the difference between a bear and a Bigfoot. My dad killed a bear that stood and walked toward him while protecting its young. My uncle killed one and stuffed it in his living room. With cousins, etc. we can be an ignorant community on some things, politics, world affairs, etc. But what we are not ignorant on is mountain terrain and local wildlife. So my sister was a guard for the entrance of a surface mine. All during the week, she would log in coal trucks and supervisors who were coming and going. This guard shack was at the very end of a holler. A mile from the nearest house and at the base of a large mountain. The roads would curve and wind from the guard shack she worked at all the way to the top of this Appalachian mountain that was being stripped from the top down to remove the coal. On the weekends, she would work and just turn away people who tried to go up there and ride their four-wheelers. There was no traffic coming and going on the weekends. She would sit in the guard shack and read books to pass the time. There was no TV, internet, etc. She did have a cell phone that would barely get any cell service, but if she played her hand right, she would get a bar or two of signal. This was a remote area in an already remote community. One afternoon, on the weekend, she was sitting and reading, and she says that she felt a weird change in the air. She was not sure what it was, but she says it's like the feeling when someone is watching you or when your gut warns you that you are in a dangerous situation. She looked up from her book and out of the side window of the guard shack, nothing. She looked forward out of the smallest window, and she saw what, at first, she thought was a bear. This animal walked on its hind legs from one side of a creek, down a steep drop-off, through the creek, and stepped up on the other side of the steep drop-off, up onto the road. This creek was about 4 feet deep, but it never faltered in its stance on its 2 legs. She said it just walked across the mining road and into a field. She said it did not look around, it just walked unbothered. The field it stepped into was extremely overgrown. The grass, brush, etc. 6 feet tall was at least. She could see it move through the weeds with its head above the weeds. She could still see its body, but not very well. When it was crossing the road, she described its hair as black and very thick. It had a very broad build. She couldn't distinguish much else about its appearance but that the hair on its body was full. It had a steady and easy glide. It walked through the field, and she lost sight of it just before the field turned into wooded mountain terrain. Several minutes after it left her eyesight, she called my dad. When he answered the phone, he asked her if she was having car trouble or if she needed something. She never really called him otherwise. He said she was hysterically crying, begging him to come help her. She told him what she saw. He asked her if she was joking, if someone could have been playing a prank on her, if she saw a bear, and why she didn't get a picture. She told him that she was paralyzed with fear. She was not able to move, she held her breath and wouldn't even breathe. She was so scared it would hear her. My dad did go and drive her home because she couldn't. He checked the height of the grass and looked around for anything he could find. He said he could only see that the grass had been waded through by something, but that's all. She swore to all of us to never tell anyone for fear of being ridiculed. Well, the following year, one of my dad's co-workers, they are both coal truck drivers, told him that he saw Bigfoot walk across an ATV trail while he was out hunting. He had covered himself in scent blockers and fell asleep at the base of a tree. He woke up and was just lying there looking up at the sky, and from his peripherals, he described seeing movement. After a moment of comprehension, he said it was Bigfoot. He admits to contemplating taking a shot at it but quickly decides the gun he had couldn't kill it. All he would do was piss it off. He did slowly go for his phone so as not to alert the creature, but by the time he took the picture, through shaking hands and fear, the picture was blurry. When my dad asked where he was hunting, it was on the other side of the mountain that my sister saw it walking toward. My dad did tell his friend what my sister saw. She is still mad at him to this day for telling anyone. Well, fast forward to last month, my renter is now working at that same guard shack. Mind you, this is a very small town. We have nothing in this town other than a Dollar General, a mom and pop grocery store, and some gas stations. No stoplights, no fast food, etc. Employment is scarce and primarily at the mine. So, the coincidence that my sister and renter have the same job is not that strange. My sister's incident was 10 years ago, too. My renter tells my dad that she saw Bigfoot while working in the guard shack. She asked him because she is a younger female, my dad is her neighbor, and she wanted to buy a gun for protection. My dad and his girlfriend help her by mowing her grass, helping her take out her trash, etc. because she is young, and with them being neighbors, my dad wants to help her while also making sure his house doesn't have an eyesore as a neighbor. Anyway, she trusted him enough to ask him if he had a gun for sale, and that was her reason why. She could not have known that my sister saw Bigfoot. She would not have known my dad's friend had seen the thing either. That man passed away years before she moved to our community. My dad's friend spent his whole life having people pick fun at him and call him crazy for it. He told everyone he met. With that being said, everyone in my community knows that it's possible for Bigfoot to thrive there. There's no point in us making a big deal about seeing Bigfoot either. We try to report that we have had an active mountain lion population for decades, and we are dismissed as crazy. The mountains in this region are largely undiscovered by anyone but us locals. In a county of only 3,000 people, there aren't a lot of people in the mountains at all times to run into a Bigfoot. We are talking about millions of acres of very rugged mountain ranges, open fields, and thousands of caves and creeks. Abundance of animals, vegetation, etc. for a large creature like that to thrive. I also wanted to share that this very community is where Expedition Bigfoot came and found unknown ape DNA. Now, This story will not make a believer out of anyone, per se, but it did make me a believer in Bigfoot. I know my sister, I know she didn't lie, she couldn't have faked that level of fear if she tried. She knows what bears look like walking as well, so I just wanted to share. A friend of mine in Brazil has seen a strange creature we are yet to identify. They saw it out of their kitchen window, it was climbing their wall, getting out of the house's perimeter, and was only seen for a few seconds. My friend described it as slim, with an almost humanoid shape and white skin, or thin fur. It was as big as an adult person. They live in a pretty small city and recently moved from their old house near the town's graveyard. There are various reports from the townsfolk of a similar creature that tries to climb over the cemetery's walls only to fall back inside again. My friend also claims to have seen it once. We have done extensive research, and there aren't any similar or big enough animals in the area that could be what we saw. I wonder if anyone with more experience has some insight and can help us solve this mystery, since it disturbs my friend to this day. This story takes place in northern Illinois back in 2007-ish. I was about 16 at the time, and we had moved into a developing neighborhood that was up and coming. The land in the neighborhood was hilly, covered in woods, and led down to a small lake. Down by the lake, there were some houses that had been there for years and were separate from the company that built our place. The neighborhood was exactly what my family was looking for. The lots were sizable and not too close to each other, and most still harbored quite a bit of wood. Perfect for maintaining some privacy and getting in touch with nature, all without being too removed from society. At least, that's how it was in our small cul-de-sac. At the time of this story, there was our home and 2 other houses on our road, one of which was the model home for the development company. Our cul-de-sac emptied out into the main vein of the neighborhood, which was a steep, forested road without any street lamps, save for the one at the end of our street. It was a really neat road that led all the way down to the lake, and my family actually hiked it often. It made for a beautiful walk, despite its hills. We had been living there for about a year, or 2, the details are fuzzy, when I had a weird, maybe mundane, or maybe paranormal encounter. We had 2 dogs. A boisterous, reckless, independent rat terrier named Belle and a sheepish, shy, but very noisy Shetland sheepdog named Zuri. They were amazing doggos that brought so much love and joy into our lives, but also some occasional stress. We didn't have a fence yet, therefore, letting the dogs out at night was sometimes uncomfortable. Raccoons were something we saw occasionally, being in the middle of the woods. The thought of Belle tearing after a raccoon, completely ignoring my pleas for her to stop, was all too real. If she picks a fight with the wrong animal, it could end badly. That fear was always in the back of my mind when letting her out. In all reality, I should have always leashed her, but she had a habit of not wanting to go when on the leash, and a majority of the time nothing happened anyway, so I didn't. One of the ways I mitigated my risk was by taking the dogs out the front door and letting them do their thing in the front yard. Our backyard was pretty wooded, but our front lawn was just grass and landscaping. From our porch, you could see the whole cul-de-sac. There was the house at the end of the loop, and then the model home at the start of the road, illuminated by the lone street light. There were still woods in the lots across from us that Belle could zoom off into, though. Which, unfortunately, one night she did. She had her nose to the ground one moment, looking to do her business, and then the next she was at full attention, glaring into the darkness beyond before peeling off. Zuri, ever jumpy and always ready to bark at the smallest disturbance, made a commotion as I raced after Belle. I was frantically yelling, crying, and begging for her to come back as I zipped across the road. I was ready to dive into the brush to rescue my tiny, foolish dog, but instead I saw her stomping along the tree line, hackles up, and bossily smelling for something. Whatever she had charged after had taken off upon seeing her coming. Thank goodness. I scooped her up and scolded her, carrying her back home in a spooked huff. I had been seriously shaken up by the whole ordeal, possibly because I hadn't seen her take off like that in a while. Usually, she was really good for me in the front yard. Well, good for Belle. She was just too confrontational for her own good. It was the following night, and I was watching Belle like a warden. I was standing right next to her in the front yard, monitoring for any body language that threatened that she was about to take off. Luckily, she was usually pretty obvious when she was about to charge. Both dogs were sniffing around, taking their time, when I lifted my gaze to look around the night. It was early autumn, and the sound of the wind rustling the trees was all around me. Other than that, it was calm and quiet. I was studying the tree line along our cul-de-sac when my eyes finally found the model home and, thus, the street lamp. That's when I saw it. My heart bludgeoned against my chest in a sudden jolt of terror, and I wrestled with disbelief, unable to process what I was seeing. There, lurching and shifting and lumbering along the road, as though the lamp was spotlighting it, was a pale, naked, humanoid figure. I use those verbs, but they aren't exactly right. The way this thing moved defies common description. It was rough and sloppy, yet eerily smooth and effortless. If anyone is familiar with Voldo from Soul Calibur, that is the closest example of its movements I can point to. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, and the limbs were too long for the body, which made its strange dance across the pavement all the more unsettling. I say dance because the way it moved was more akin to that than walking. It was gaudily flinging its arms forward, then heaving its legs after in large arcs, clumsy but defyingly fluid. As it lurked along, one glaring detail pierced my senses. It was completely devoid of any facial features. This thing, this swaying, white, sickly thing, had no face. Nothing at all. I gawked in horror as the figure carried steadily along its route, passing right by our cul-de-sac and down the wooded, steep blackness of the main road that lay ahead. It never once seemed aware of me, but I was blaringly aware of it. And then, all too fast and violently, I remembered the little, argumentative, confrontational dog at my feet and her very noisy sister. I dove for Belle and swept her up, overcome with terror as my nerves were electrified. I bounded to the porch and opened the door to drop her inside, shutting it in a snap. All I could think of was Zuri spotting whatever the hell it was and barking, earning its attention. I ran to the sheltie, and by some miracle, she was none the wiser to the visitor, just my alarmed state. I, too, picked her up and fled inside. My room was upstairs with a similar vantage point to the cul-de-sac, and I sprang up the steps, daring to get one last glimpse of the naked, faceless creature. By the time I parted my blinds and pressed my face against the window, terrified but curious, there was nothing but the street lamp against the inky dark. Whatever it was, it had gone on. I always let the dogs out in the backyard after that. It was back sometime in 2019, late in the year. One of my friends, whose name is Ted, saw something in the middle of the night. Tired and feeling fatigued, he woke up, rolling out of bed, to head to the bathroom and then to the kitchen for a late-night snack. While indulging in his snack, he began walking around his living room until he made his way to the back of the house. It was on the second floor by the kitchen, where, while staring outside at whatever, a sudden figure in his backyard caught his attention. The yard is huge, and there is nothing really in it aside from 2 trees. One of which has since rotted and fallen down. He noticed a bit past the rotted tree was a figure with glowing reds, a large snout, and standing at an approximate 7 to 8 feet tall, after seeing the creature reared up on its legs and judging its size by how tall it appeared to be next to the tree. It also had jet black fur, as well as a muscular physique similar to Arnold back in the 80s, a long snout with very large perked ears similar to a German shepherd or wolf, and what looked to be antlers, or maybe that was just part of its long ears. He doesn't really know because it was very dark. The creature took a sniff and looked directly at him. As his eyes met the gaze of the creature's, he noticed that the eyes were a shade of blood red, the same color mentioned before. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. But he also mentioned that he'd seen so many weird things and such that he wasn't really fazed by them in the slightest. He knew what he was looking at was the real deal and saw its breath in the cold night air. As the creature grunted and bared its teeth, it also started growling at him. The growl wasn't that of any normal animal, but a deep primal guttural growl, nothing like he's ever heard before. The creature then took one last gaze at him and ran off, jumping the fence. He shortly afterwards returned to his room, laying in bed, wondering what he really saw. He found it hard to fall back to sleep, but late on he luckily did. He still wonders, to this day, if the creature will ever return or if he will ever see it again. This encounter was not far from where I live but is absolutely horrifying to think about because we live in the suburbs. To this day, he still does not know what he really saw, and it can only be left up to whomever's imagination. This occurred in the Middle Tennessee region. A few weeks ago, I was driving to work in the early morning, pre-dawn hours. The road is pretty much the main road through the area, and deer are a pretty common sight year-round in this area. So as I was driving to work on my left, I saw the familiar silhouette of a deer about to cross the street, and I slowed down a bit to compensate and prepare for any more of the herd that might decide to jump across. It was far enough away that I didn't have to slow, but maybe 5 or 10 miles per hour slower, so not a huge shift, just enough to let it pass. So it runs across in front of me, and only as I pass it and my headlights hit it do I realize that something is off. Of course, by then it's too late for a detailed look, as I can't stop and look. So description, it was almost all white. I'll be willing to concede this as an illusion of the headlights passing as well as that albino and light colorings do happen on occasion. However, its proportions were off just ever so slightly. I only got an impression, and I wouldn't want to be inaccurate, so if I tried to draw an approximation, you'd think it was a llama or an alpaca, but that is not what it appeared as. It simply had a similar build. Its legs were just ever so slightly too long for a deer, and its neck as well. It was a head or two taller than my car. All of that is hindsight, however, from what set my alarm bells off, which was the way it was walking. Anyone familiar with deer knows how they usually bound and run across a street. This thing did only what I can describe as a sort of prancing. If you've ever seen a dog do that little run where their legs are cartoonishly pittering very fast together but they aren't bending their knees, this is what it kind of looked like. Like Fred Flintstone going bowling. I have not been able to find a video of deer doing this canter, nor llamas or alpacas. They all sort of lope instead. I am perfectly willing to concede a misidentification, and I'd be glad for a correction, but this has got me baffled. As I've looked into this, I've come across the idea of a not deer and such, but none of it quite fits. So any ideas to look into would be appreciated. My great uncle owns a lot of land in northern Saskatchewan, Canada. Some of this was pasture that he used for cattle, but half of one of his largest properties is fenced off, and the cows can't go there. In the sectioned off lactose-free zone, the entire place is densely packed with foliage. I mean, when I hunt, I almost only use game trails and small clearings because a lot of the brush is too thick to get through without a machete. The ground itself is blotted with some small, steep hills towards the entrance to the property. We've always had lots of wildlife, like big cats and bears, that could harm people. I actually had to put down a bear that came into our camp and was far too comfortable with people not too long after. So since I was young, I have learned to recognize the sounds and sights around me, and while cautious, I am rarely afraid of anything out there, especially given that I am usually armed when I am not with multiple people. The summer before last, we had a remarkably calm experience. There were hardly any critters we had to deal with, and it seemed the bears and pests were leaving us alone. No droppings, many small game trails had grown in, and the camp that usually took 2 days to set up was exactly how we had left it the previous trip. It was peaceful, and being summer, I filled the days with woodworking fishing trips, the occasional hike looking for berries, and setting traps for rabbits, grouse, and other small game that could be prepared quickly over the fire with my family, but mostly came up unlucky. Regardless of the seeming lack of disturbances, we were always careful at night, making sure to have a bright light and keep an eye out for anything. After the first week, we began hearing noises around the camp very late at night that would drive the dog insane all night, to the point where we just had to keep her inside but never saw anything. It almost felt like whatever it was probing and checking out our camp nightly, but always staying far enough away and hidden enough that we could never see it with our spotlights. Then one night, just like any other, bar the eerie quietness that usually came around that time, I left my mother's camper a couple hours after the daylight had disappeared with a lantern-style LED light, and as a rarity, I didn't have anything to defend myself, no gun, no bear spray, not even a knife, so I was a little bit more cautious and observant than usual given that I felt more vulnerable. As I walked from the exit of my mom's camper, I looked around for a minute, scanning the tree line, and then began the loop around to my door. I panned as I walked from right to left from the entrance to the fire pit and then to the table. It was there, just behind the table, not 20 feet away, that I saw a naked, extremely pale, almost gray, probably just because of the dark, lanky humanoid figure standing still and directly facing me. As it caught my gaze, I felt my heart drop and immediately go cold. I probably only stared for 3 seconds at most, but it felt like several minutes as my brain processed what I was seeing. It stood somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5 feet tall with low, slumped shoulders and had a frail, thin body that reminded me of photos from the Holocaust but with disproportionately long limbs. I couldn't see the legs fully because of the table, but what I could see looked like sinew and skin stretched over the leanest and thinnest body I've ever seen. I know I might sound like a dramatic bitch, but I couldn't describe the primal fear and shock that came over me. It was like a combination of the feeling you get from being threatened at gunpoint and hearing something stalk you in the woods, but it ramped up to the point where I could barely think. I couldn't make out many details of the face, but the light cast small shadows on it that made it look like it had shallow features similar to a nose, lips, and eye sockets that were smoothed down, almost like Voldemort and Slenderman's love child. I ran like my life depended on it. TBH, I thought it might have, the last few feet to my door. Once inside, I grabbed the shotgun, stuffed several shells in my pocket, loaded the gun, and aimed it at the door. I sat in silence with the hammer cocked back, waiting for the doorknob to turn or the frosted glass to break. I sat and waited for hours into the early morning, expecting to see or hear something, but I never did, not even any foliage or items moving. Eventually, around 4 a.m., I lowered my guard, propped the shotgun next to my bed, and hesitantly went to sleep. When I woke up, I could hardly believe what I had seen the night before. I was around the area to see if there were any shapes or items that I could have mistaken and warped in my mind into the creature I saw, but the only thing in that area was a table with some pots and pans on it that were blackened from the fire. I'm still not quite sure what to make of it, but I do have some ideas from what I witnessed. Given the fact that I believe it was stalking us and staking out our camp for several nights, along with positioning itself between me and my mother's camper, directly in front of the path that I took every night, I believe that it had some level of intelligence comparable to a person laying a trap or setting something up in an area where they know their activity. As I mentioned, I looked around after exiting my mother's camper and never heard anything, which tells me that either it was waiting there watching or that it was so incredibly quiet that I never heard it move even a leaf, which wouldn't line up with us hearing the disturbances from the previous nights. It also left as quietly as it appeared, which leaves three options. Either it went out of its way to use the same road entering the camp that a person would for convenience, it silently crept out through the game trails, or it didn't leave until after I had lowered my guard and my adrenaline died down. I'm honestly not sure which option is more likely or more off-putting. I'm not really sure what I saw, but I know it wasn't human. The photos and drawings of these crawlers reminded me a great deal of them. So I thought I'd share. Maybe one of you could enlighten me as to what it could have been doing, its intent, or provide an explanation for its behavior. I know it's not worth much online, but hand to God, I swear this isn't a piece of fanciful writing. My grandmother lives by herself in a little double-wide. Out back, there is a big backyard, a huge field that a neighbor farms, and woods beyond that. I have always gotten the sensation that something was out in those fields, older than the land, almost a part of the land. Last night, she fell and dislocated her shoulder. My parents took her to the ER, and I volunteered to keep watch overnight with her. As soon as I stepped foot in that house, I felt pressure and an unclean feeling come over me. All through the night, my skin was crawling, and I just felt unclean and like something was in the house with us. This morning, when I came back home, my mom told me something that had me coming here for answers. She said that when she was helping my grandma out of the car that night, she saw something walk through the backyard. She said the best word she could use to describe it was werewolf. She said it was tall, gangly, and on all fours with eye shine. She has also felt an unclean feeling. I know a little bit about skinwalkers, and what she described sounded a lot like one. I also study the paranormal, so I'm also of the opinion that the negative spirit is the culprit. If it is a skinwalker, would Catholic prayers and blessings work, or do I need something else? It was the spring of 2007. My then boyfriend and I were on our way from New York down to Miami to go to a music festival. We were driving south on the highway along the east coast of Central Florida when we pulled into a rest area so that he could catch a nap. He had been driving all day when he decided that he desperately needed a short rest before getting back behind the wheel. We had very recently bought the van, and he did not think that I could handle maneuvering it, so he was doing all of the driving. I later proved him wrong. He parked, jumped in the back of the van, and laid down on the futon mattress that we had laid there. He told me to leave him alone, and he proceeded to pass out from exhaustion. I was pretty freaked out because the rest area building was unmanned, locked up, and dark inside. The restrooms were closed. The small rest area building was surrounded by dark woods. There were about 4 other cars in the small parking lot, but there was no sign of any drivers, so I imagined they were having an emergency lay down as well. Normally, I would never have set foot outside of the van alone in such a scenario. My instincts told me not to get out of the van. But I had taken some Midol for my menstrual cramps, and they had given me brutal nausea. I needed some pretzels. I mustered up all of my courage, opened the passenger side door, and squeezed through the space between our vehicle and the vehicle that was parked directly next to ours. As soon as I had a clear line of sight to the front of the rest stop building, I saw the thing. I saw it clearly. Straight ahead, I saw the brightly lit front facade of the rest stop. To the left of the doors was IT. To the right of the doors was a vending machine. Immediately, it communicated with me. I was flooded with what I consider a telepathic message from the being: I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. I must travel by night and exist in darkness. I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. And I felt an enormous wave of compassion for the being rather than fear, which may seem like a more logical reaction to someone hearing this story. For some reason, my brain only categorized IT as one thing initially, an outsider worthy of compassion and tolerance. Its skin was pure chalk white. Not the skin tone white, but the color white. Its eyes were several times larger than ours, it had 2 little air holes for a nose, and it had a very thin mouth. Its frame was completely concealed by its enormous, long, black hooded robe. It looked as though it was quite gaunt underneath, pretty frail looking. It was sitting on its bottom, knees bent, back against the brick front of the rest area, to the left of the front doors of the rest area. It was sitting with its back very straight, tall, and erect. It seemed in awe of me, or maybe in awe that I was actually approaching it. It looked vaguely like a human, very vaguely. Its face was snake-like. Its eyes were right on me. I threw a little everyday smile in its direction, and then I did something strange. I continued to walk toward the rest area even after seeing it. I walked toward the rest area building, closer to it. I walked forward about 20 feet from the rear of the van to the rest area steps, up the 20 or so steps, and to the right, where the vending machine was located. My thoughts at this point were very bizarre in retrospect. I felt bad for the thing. I didn't want it to feel different. I know that sounds hilariously quaint, if we are indeed talking about an interdimensional being, but I didn't want to run back into the van because I didn't want to hurt its feelings. I didn't want to make it feel like a freak. It had already told me that it could not be seen due to the way people would react, so I wanted it to know that I didn't judge it for the way it looked and that I was willing to come to terms with its horrific appearance in order to extend some humanity to it. I did not know about fallen angels and such at the time, so it was with that very bizarrely strong conviction to be righteous and humane toward it that I walked toward the vending machine. I actually got pretzels. I'm telling you, my stomach was churning. I used the vending machine with my back to it. Snyder's in hand, I swiveled around to look at it again before descending back down the steps. It was at that moment that pure terror rippled through me. I was closer to it now, approximately 15 feet away, and I could see now that there was definitely no way that it was human. It was staring right at me like a wide-eyed insect. It was still in exactly the same position, except for the fact that it had turned its head to look at me better as my position changed. It looked like an alien. It looked like a demon. It was not human. Its huge, one-dimensional eyes. Were they totally black? I'm not sure. But I know that it did not have whites in its eyes. They were almond-shaped, like the classic alien eye that we all know. It was then that I realized that it was extremely freaking tall, unthinkably tall. Although I was standing and it was sitting, its head still stood taller than mine. Its huge eyes were fixed on me totally, with fascination, alarm, and the most intense focus. Just like the way my cat looks at something right before she pounces on it. When I had made the decision to climb the stairs towards it and not to retreat to the van, I thought that it was sitting on top of something, and that was why its head was raised up so high. Now, from this closer perspective, I could see that it was not sitting on anything but its own butt. If I had realized that it was this ducking tall at the start, I very well may not have gone up the stairs. So, after the ripple of terror went through me, I responded by smiling the way you smile at a stranger when your eyes catch on the bus. I shot at a casual, thin, innocuous little hey how ya doin' smile. Why and how I acted as if things were totally ducking normal, I cannot explain. I have never acted so cool in my life. There is a Seinfeld episode when Elaine says that one of the reasons that she is a decent person is because when I see freaks in the street, I never ever stare at them, and yet I'm careful not to look away, because I want to make the freaks feel comfortable. So that's actually what was going through my head, believe it or not. If I were to guess what the thing was doing when I encountered it, judging by its body language, I would say that it was somewhat displaced and resting. But I have no clue, maybe it was in the middle of something far more sinister. It did not look like a mutant or an experiment. It looked ancient, timeless, and placeless. Graceful, horrible. It was also firmly in this dimension when I saw it. It was not a hazy vision in the slightest. The lighting was not dim. It was not even a remotely ethereal experience. The extremely bright lights that illuminated the front facade of the rest area building revealed every contour of this entity. If only I had been closer, I could have provided much more detail about its facial features. As I was walking back to the van, I quickly strategized about how to make sure that my fear did not paralyze me and prohibit me from getting safely inside the car. I decided not to look back or even around me as I turned the key, because if I saw that it had moved or that it was coming towards me, I would have been too terrified to manage with the car keys. I got in the van. I locked the door. I screamed that we needed to leave immediately. We did. As we drove away, about 90 seconds after it was last in my sight, I looked out the window and saw that it was gone. There was nothing where it had been. Just a brick wall and a concrete floor. I live in the country. Me and my brother were walking back home, and it was a few minutes past midnight. There are no houses beside where we live, just fields, bushes, and trees. We were walking, and I felt like something was wrong. I felt like something was watching us, but I didn't think too much of it. Then we heard a noise. I can't explain it because it was nothing I had heard before. My brother said it was a faraway gunshot, and I just believed him. He later said that he just said it to calm me down. We kept walking with the flashlight on, and he put some music on to make me calm. At one point, I looked to my right and saw this flashlight. It looked like a person was holding it, but you could clearly see there was no one holding it. My brother turned off the flashlight, and we kept looking at it. The light turned into two, and it seemed like it was a car that turned towards us. The light went over us like somebody was pointing flashlights. We panicked but didn't move. A few seconds later, the lights disappeared. We started to walk faster towards our house, but coming over the hill, we saw this creature on the left side of the road, just completely still. My brother didn't wear glasses at the time, and he said he just saw something like an orb changing forms, but I was wearing glasses, and what I saw still makes me want to puke. I saw a luminescent humanoid-like being, which was something I had never seen before. The thing started changing its form and became something like a fox going from one side of the road to the other. At this point, we were freaking out. I started to run towards the house as it was just a few meters away, but my brother stopped me to calm me down as I was shocked. When this happened, we were in our driveway, and I had my back to it. He was holding my shoulders, telling me to calm down, but then he looked towards the darkness and ran away. I didn't have the balls to look back, so I ran after him and towards the door. He gave me the key, and I tried to open the door with my hands shaking, which was absolutely hard. He said that he saw the creature standing up and that he looked like a man, but it wasn't a man at all. Did anybody have any encounters like this? This happened last night, and I still can't explain what happened. I'm shocked and scared. A long time ago, I went camping at a place here in New Mexico named Oasis State Park. Back then, my church had many kids running around, and I made good friends with one. I was good enough friends with him to be invited on a camping trip with him, his father, and his little sister. Of course I brought everything, from a Bible, I'd Kwai, so don't ask lol, to spare clothes for a 3-day camping trip, a small pocket knife, a lantern, my sleeping bag, and my own tent, along with basic essentials like socks, a toothbrush, and toothpaste. It probably doesn't bear importance, but I was the oldest, maybe 12, Ryan was a few weeks younger than me, and his sister was around 8. I'm 19 now and just barely, so you do the math as to what year this happened in. The first day, we set up our tents and proceeded to have a fantastic time. Me and my friend Ryan finished our tents and walked to a pond not at all far from our tents. The trail to it was literally next to our site. I find it important now to mention that yes, there were trees, but not like any forest. These were small, feeble trees clearly recently planted and obviously barely surviving. I remember them faintly, as I didn't really pay attention to shrubbery short of collecting sticks and watching out for cacti when me and Ryan explored the trail. Anyway, like I was saying, me and Ryan had a blast, even if we had to drag his sister around because she was bored and couldn't explore alone. We saw a pretty snake, sleek and black. I don't remember the species, at the pond getting a drink. Once it finished, it shot off into the brush. Other than that, only 2 other features of this park are important. The bathroom was up a slight incline along the trail, maybe 2 or 3 campsites away from ours. That and a bunch of sand dunes built around rocky pillars, nature pillars like thin mesas, sat ahead of our campsite, maybe 3 campsites away. Beyond those pillars was a fenced-off, very flat, and very dry area, if I remember correctly. The bathroom from the front of my tent was to the left, and the dunes were directly ahead through a badly kept trail. The first day was fine, and that night we got a campfire going, had s'mores, and told scary stories. The dad told the only scary stories that night, and I'm sure the man's faith affected the gore level of the story considering we were kids. It was about some abandoned building with ghosts or something, and it wasn't very scary. I went to bed that night expecting a cold but peaceful sleep. At some point, I woke up and had to pee. I didn't feel like walking all the way to the bathroom, lazy me, right? So I just went ahead and urinated on a small birch tree that sat literally 4 feet away from my tent. After that, I was back asleep in my tent. I don't remember how long I was asleep before waking up to the feeling of needing to poop. It had just rained, I could tell from a tiny leak in the tent, and I wasn't going to poop on a tree. Well, my little LED lantern wasn't very powerful, and now my shoes were outside the tent completely wet, but I needed to go, and it wasn't going to wait, so I decided to just deal with it. Like literally every tent I've ever owned, and probably every tent ever, my tent had 2 doors. Not a front and back door, but a zipped shut door with a zipped shut screen door outside that. This way, you can see outside your tent without having a few mosquitoes move in for the night. So, of course, having heard coyote howls, quick note, coyote, I wanted to check the outside of my tent before stepping out, and also, being a kid, I didn't realize how easily a wild, hungry coyote could rip through my flimsy nylon screen. So I unzipped the tent door and turned on my LED lantern. For a few seconds, everything seemed clear, and the rain had already stopped. Welcome to New Mexico weather, so I decided it would be safe. I began to unzip the tent screen when I heard a very loud howl, like a coyote but much deeper. If you've heard of coyotes, they can get pretty high-pitched, so this was weird. It took a moment for my ADHD self to stop focusing on the weird pitch and realize that the howl sounded close, like from the pond. I didn't even really think to turn off my lantern, I just went to close the tent flap. About a third of the way through zipping the actual tent flap shut, I hear crunching, like when you're on a pebble-filled playground and somebody is casually walking. This is because the tent sites had pebble flooring, just a bunch of tiny little pebbles in a big open circle to make a smoother camp area. Not only was the howl odd, but the footsteps themselves were odd. There was a fair bit of time between each step, and it sounded like they were being dragged with eating steps, like claws. Well, ADHD me froze in my task, and thousands of ideas distracted me from closing the tent. Sure enough, it took just long enough for the creature at our site to find the front of my tent. I instantly froze. For the first time in my life, my mind was truly blank. Sure, I don't think things through, but I never sit and think about nothing. This thing was huge from what my crappy lantern showed. It was big and had a mix of colors on the back, all ranging in random patterns of brown and black fur. It was rather bulky on top, but not like a bodybuilder, more like natural, solid muscle that might have been made from lots of running. Furthermore, it was thin in the middle and had stocky legs and arms. The legs by the hips were stockier than any other part of its limbs. Aside from that, I'd note that its fur was brighter than most dog-man depictions I've seen, like on the muzzle, which was whitish along the bottom. Now I've done some research on dog men since then, and like most depictions and descriptions, it had smaller ears and glowing eyes, most likely glowing from my lantern. If you wanted an idea to base the ears off of, they sat directly on top, like a cat trying to hear something. At some point, it leaned down and sniffed the tree before turning to me and looking me in the eye for a moment. But the thing is, when it leaned down, its hind legs, I assume, made some strange popping sounds, like your knuckles but much louder. I looked into those eyes, though, and I swear I've never been more afraid in my life. Have you ever looked at something, just looked it in the eyes, and realized you're the prey? That primal fear that extends beyond normal fear when you realize that this thing looking back at you has all the power, that you are its prey, and that it has no discernible mercy. I felt that right then, knowing that no tent wall was stopping that beast if it wanted to crush my skull in its jaws. I never went to the bathroom. I know what some people are going to say, it was just some weirdo with coyote skins or a fake fur coat. It couldn't have been. The fur wasn't very thick, so I could see the muscles ripple as they moved, plus the fur was flesh with its disjointed body. Stranger yet, before it moved off into the darkness, it lowered to all fours, and when it did this, its knees made more of the popping sound. It was the sound of bones hitting bones awkwardly in your body. I'm sure of it now. Its knees had to disjoin and slide into a different position for it to run on all fours. This is my experience, and some may call it bullshit, but whatever. About 7 years ago, I was driving through NYS at 17 a.m. as I was passing a wooded area. I saw this thing walking upright into the trees. It had legs as long as my whole body and sort of slouched, but it was still at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It was dark brown in color, almost like it was made of wood. It looked like wood. As soon as I saw it, I was overwhelmed with emotion and cried. It was the most involuntary cry I've ever had, and still, when I think about this thing I saw, even right now, I cry. Like a knot in my heart, I can't fight the tears. It's the only time I have ever seen anything that I can't explain or that I expect people to not believe me. I think about it a lot, and I recently saw an online post from Earth is Scary, and it brought back all these weird feelings about seeing this thing. I have referred to it as that stickman I saw but could never find more than a few cartoons for stickmen. I don't know the point of my post, but if anyone can share if they have seen something similar or heard of something, it has been haunting me for years. What surprises me is that if I think about this creature, even all this time later, I'll cry. Why cry? It wasn't sad, dead, or even scary. There's a nature park with hiking trails about 10 miles from my house. I live in a fairly suburban area, so it's difficult to find places to walk without encountering other people or dogs. Plus, it's nice to walk through trees and see deer rather than looking at row after row of houses and fences. My dog and I walk there fairly often. I know most of the trails by heart, even though my sense of direction is terrible. After breakfast this morning, I decided to load up my dog and head up there. We like to walk when no one else is there, so it feels like we're actually deep in nature, and I figured the morning of Christmas Eve would be a time everyone was visiting family, cooking, or otherwise occupied indoors. I was right. There were no other cars in the parking lot when I got there, not even any employees. The museum section of the park was closed for Christmas while the trail stayed open. Like most places, this has been much hotter than usual in December, so it was warm and breezy, basically perfect walking weather. I don't get cell service or internet on the trail, so it wasn't like calls or emails would be coming in to bother me until after I was done. My dog and I set out down the trail that felt the most woodsy and where we had the best chance of seeing wildlife, which was more exciting than squirrels. The first mile or so was totally normal. We saw squirrels and heard birds, and my dog sniffed all the poo she could find. We had some rain a few days ago, so some sections of the trail were just puddles of mud that I had to pick through, but nothing unusual. It was relaxing and a great way to start off the holiday. I don't know how to explain what changed, but I started to feel just generally unsettled. Everything startled me, and I was constantly looking behind me, convinced I would see something there but praying I wouldn't. It felt like we weren't alone. I should mention that this isn't exactly a strange feeling for me. I love horror movies and stories, and of course there's plenty that start with a character alone in the woods. I tried to convince myself that it was just last night's sleep visit coming back to bite me now that I was by myself. Anyway, I rely on my dog to be a paranormal activity detector. They always say animals are more sensitive than humans, so I count on her to let me know if something's up. She was still going about her business, sniffing and whatnot, so I tried to shrug it off. The farther we went, the more I heard things crunching just off the trail, like someone was walking next to me in the woods. I didn't see anything, and again, my dog was oblivious. I told myself it was just deer or squirrels jumping around, more active than usual because no one else had been walking. My presence was probably scaring them out of their hiding places. It was around the start of the third mile that I started feeling extremely cold for no apparent reason. I'm typically always hot, and it was a toasty 70 degrees with what felt like 1,000,000% humidity this morning. It was cloudy, and it's always cooler in the woods, but not like this. I was sweating, and my skin felt hot, but it was like I was freezing from the inside out, like someone had super shielded my bones. I decided I was probably getting sick and should pick up the pace so I could get home and take my temperature. Now, this trail is a 4-mile loop that spits you back out in the parking lot at its end. By that point, I was a little over halfway done, so I decided to finish the trail instead of turning around. I felt an insane pressure starting to build in my ears, like when they're about to pop, but they never did. My throat began to burn and ache. Each time I swallowed, it was like trying to swallow a branch. My stomach started cramping, too. I decided I was definitely sick with the flu or COVID or something and picked up the pace, figuring I may have some diarrhea in the future and not wanting to get caught in the middle of the woods with no culturally acceptable toilet nearby. We'd probably made it another quarter mile or so when we came to a fork where there definitely should not have been one. The main trail has several branches that split off of it, but that was at the very beginning. I've walked this trail dozens of times, and I can guarantee there should not have been a fork right there. I stopped for a few seconds and just stared at it, confused. I mentioned my terrible sense of direction, so I tried to explain to myself that maybe I got turned around at some point without realizing it because I was feeling so ill. Still, this park has a map and a bench at every fork so people don't get lost, and I didn't see either of those, which only made me more uneasy and also made me realize I had no clue which way to go. When my dog started to pull toward the right branch, I decided to trust her intuition and go with it. I can't say exactly what it was that made me stop, but suddenly everything in me was screaming to turn around. My instincts about direction are almost always wrong, so I usually go the opposite way my gut tells me. But this was totally different. I had the niggling feeling that if I kept walking, I would be going straight into danger, no matter what my clueless dog seemed to think. There was also a headache building in my skull, as though someone had injected air directly into my brain, and it was pressing on my temples, begging to be let out. I stopped and closed my eyes for a second, trying to collect my thoughts and get my bearings. When I opened my eyes, I noticed a deer in the middle of the path, maybe 20 feet away. It was staring directly at me, completely unmoving and not blinking. It had a single antler spaced exactly between its ears, and it was sitting like a dog with its back legs tucked under its body. Otherwise, it looked normal, deer coloring, deer body, deer eyes, but that only made the differences all the more unnerving. I stared at it blankly for a few seconds before dimly remembering that I had my phone and should take a picture. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, but it wouldn't load, just a black screen like someone had covered the lens. Frustrated, I closed the app and lowered my phone to see if the deer was still there or if it had run away due to my movement. I wish it had. But when I moved my phone, I saw that the deer had roughly halved the distance between us, even though I hadn't heard anything. It was standing too, but it looked wrong, like it was putting too much weight on its front legs. The front legs were slightly bent, like it was about to charge at me. That was it. The picture wasn't worth it. I turned and started sprinting the other way. I had only taken a few steps before my arm yanked back. My dog hadn't moved. She was straining against her harness, trying to go back down that path. The deer was even closer than it had been, though it was again sitting. I yanked my dog's leash harder than I ever had before, and she reluctantly came back to me. And I ran, despite the pain in my stomach, my lungs, my head, everything. I ran. I'm not the most in shape person, but I ran for what felt like miles, back the way we'd come, away from the fork that shouldn't have been there, and whatever the hell was wrong with that deer. I could hear my dog panting and gasping, and she kept dropping behind me, but I didn't let us slow down, even when my legs were burning and I felt like I was going to pass out. We ran all the way to the parking lot, jumped in the car, and raced home. I don't have an explanation for what happened. Even weirder, I feel fine now. I don't have a fever, my throat feels normal, and my headache's gone. My stomach is still upset and my legs are incredibly sore, but that's probably because I'm not used to running like that, or running at all. My dog is exhausted, but overall, it seems none the worse for wear. One other thing. I had set up my Fitbit to track the walk before we went in, since I like to know how far we've gone. It should have been just over 4 miles, since that's the length of the loop plus a little extra for the detour we made. But according to my Fitbit, we only went 2 miles. The weirder part is that it says we walked 2 miles in an hour and a half. I'm not the world's fastest walker, but I definitely walk faster than that, and I spent the last half running as fast as I could. I know for a fact we went further than 2 miles in that time period, but apparently part of the walk is just gone. In any case, I think I'll take a friend next time I walk. I'm a 24-year-old male living in the Philippines. This is not even my story, but my dad's. It happened when I was a year old, and my mother was pregnant with my younger sister. We lived in a semi-rural area where we had a lot of relatives, and everybody knew each other in the neighborhood. My dad was out watering the plants in the backyard when he noticed a huge black bird perched on a low branch in a tree we used to have in our backyard. I know, big deal, right? Except the bird had unnaturally bloodshot eyes and looked back at my dad like it was thinking. Dad was a bit unsettled, but he thought nothing more of it as he resumed his work and went inside afterwards. Hours passed, and it was after dark. My dad went out again to do some more chores in our backyard. He was just finishing up when he noticed, in the alley between our house and the fence separating us from the neighbors, some small creature shuffling across a puddle of water on the pavement. Now, we had a pet turtle, a red-eared slider, and my dad thought that the turtle somehow got out of its tank and was making its way across the alley. But on closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't our turtle, but, I kid you not, a crab. That's right, a crab. Hundreds of miles away from the sea. It was huge, dinner plate sized. And what further unnerved my dad was that this crab had, like the bird from earlier in the morning, bloodshot eyes. The crab stopped to look at my dad with, according to him, the same intense stare the bird gave him. My dad, having had enough, quickly went inside, a bit creeped out at everything that happened that day. The next day, Dad was out speaking with the elders in the neighborhood about what he had seen the previous day. They told him it was an aswang. Now, in rural areas of the Philippines, there are stories of aswangs, which are a kind of Philippine analog to vampires in Western folklore. They are said to be shapeshifters who enjoy feasting on human and animal entrails, but a favorite delicacy of aswangs is unborn fetuses. An aswang would crawl atop a roof at night, directly above a pregnant woman as she slept, slip its long, prehensile tongue through an opening in the roof, and lap up the fetus like a mosquito would blood. As it happened, my mother was pregnant with my sister. One old man claimed he knew the aswang that paid a visit to our home. He told my dad that this particular aswang wasn't trying to eat my sister, but that it just liked being around pregnant women, like my mom, because it was intoxicating to all aswangs. It doesn't make it less creepy, though, and I'm glad that aswang wasn't one of the malevolent ones. It was an interesting story, though. I should pay more visits to my dad to hear more stories from him. Warning, listen to this following story at your own risk, as the person who shared this story with us mentioned not to read it out loud or they will find you, but we want to take our chance and see what happens. As for you people, listen to this story at your own risk, you've been warned. The story, I cannot stress this enough. Do not read this story out loud. Do not mention anything about this story in any audible way. Pass this on via message through cyberspace only. It seems to be the only way to keep your distance from them without them finding you. Please, 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 for your own safety, do not say anything about this out loud, especially their name. Those that I'm referring to are known by a few names. Navajo culture refers to them as Yinaldlishi. Some natives in Canada, the northwestern coast, and the Great Lakes region were referred to as Wendigos. I refer to them as skinwalkers. Call them what you will, but do not say any of their names out loud. I say this because they hear their name and respond to it the way a great white shark reacts to a drop of blood in the open ocean. It is not a simple hunt that the skinwalkers perform in the general direction of the audible name. It is an instinct. A drive so animalistic that it is ingrained in every single one of them. Say it once, and you may be lucky that the trail goes cold. Their senses are diluted, and you escape. Say it twice, well, at that point, you're playing with fire. You're taunting something that not even your worst nightmares could come close to touching. They will not hunt you down instantly. No, all things take time in this world. They do not move fast, but they move at a steady pace. They will find you. Whether it be days, weeks, months, or years, well, that depends on just how evasive you manage to be. But don't worry, they all catch up eventually. I'm writing this to you simply because I have made that mistake. Once, when I was young, I read the name out loud in a folklore book while trying to sound it out. Strike one. The second mistake I made just last month was at a trivia night at my local bar. The question referred to the mythical creatures of terror in Navajo folklore, and I guess after one too many shots, the name slipped out of my mouth. I know they're coming for me. It's only a matter of time. I'm going to keep a running log. It's the only way I'll stay sane. Maybe somebody will stumble upon this and finally get some mainstream knowledge on this legend. Navajo tribes are extremely tight-lipped about this subject for good reason. Skinwalkers respond to audible sounds of their names. They aren't like demons from exorcism movies who have proper names. No, these things all go by their standard names of Skinwalker, Wendigo, or Yinaldlishi. For simplicity and to save myself time, they'll be Skinwalkers from here on out. Nobody knows the true figure of Skinwalkers. There are accounts from those who were lucky enough to escape for just long enough. Skinwalkers are genderless, gaunt, pale figures. They stand 7 to 8 feet tall. At times they move to all fours and crawl around with the grace of a tiger or lion, yet most are comfortable and mobile on their 2 feet as bipedals. Some take on the shape of a moose head with their long and wide paddle-like antlers. Some purely take the shape of a human face with barely recognizable features. The best way I can describe their human appearance is similar to the Slender Man stories, of a tall and elongated thin man with no face. They don't kill you, not instantly. They slowly drive you mad. They thrive on the mental breakdown that you begin to feel every time you think you see them. The more that you mentally bleed out with your insanity, the more that comes near. The Navajo legend is that more appear to quicken the breakdown, but the initial responder is the only one who gets the kill. Now for the fun part. Skinwalkers survive on flesh and emotional distress. They don't destroy a body, only the essence of the human spirit. They inhabit the flesh of those they kill. They walk around wearing their kill skin, allowing them to blend in with the public. They never look fully there, they look as though they are wearing a semi-expensive Halloween costume. To those that aren't paying attention, nobody bats an eye. But if you really look hard, you'll see the absence of life in their eyes. You'll notice how clumsily they string sentences together. You'll notice that their mouth doesn't seem to sync up with what the tongue is saying. Imagine a museum of wax with all the perfect collections of human replications. Imagine those being heated to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, just enough to start becoming deformed. Maybe the wax expands in certain areas. Facial features don't match the mood they seem to be expressing. That's a skinwalker. There's a good chance you've walked past a couple in your life, but maybe you were just too wrapped up in that Facebook post. They absorb your mental distress, whether it's thoughts, emotions, memories, etc. It's been said that they speak to people in voices that are familiar to their prey. You can hear people that have been dead for 40 years or hear somebody you just talked to earlier in the day. They are tricksters, more or less. The hunt is more than half the fun for them. The Midwestern Canadian tribes depicted the Wendigos as giant coyotes. It's really fitting. They hunt in packs, there's a leader, they torment their prey, and they are incredibly vocal. I'm sure you're asking yourself, damn, this kid sure knows a lot about a legend that the people don't talk about. Well yeah, no SHT, Sherlock. You want to know how I found out? Because these duckers have found me. They've been visible a few times, but I can feel them around me at all times. I can feel their ducked up, soulless eyes on me everywhere. The worst? Trying to ducking sleep. I'm too afraid to sleep with my lights off. There's too much moonlight pouring into my bedroom, which only gives me the opportunity to see the shadows fall across my bedroom floor. If I close the shades, I can hear them scratching at the windows, trying to get a view. If I leave the lights on, it's impossible to see what's on the other side of the window. Do you want to know what's scarier than being stalked by deformed, half-melted humans? Not knowing if they are on the outskirts of your property or if they are right in front of your window, staring at your every move. I haven't been able to tell how good their sight is at night. I've watched them at night as much as they have watched me. I don't see the Reaper during the day. The Reaper is what I call the one coming after me. I'm not sure if it's the same one, but I can just feel it is. I first spotted it at the edge of my tree line in my yard. It was about 2 days after I said it for the second time. I knew what it was when I saw it. It was a milky figure about 50 yards from me. I couldn't just brush it off because it didn't magically disappear like in all other ghost stories, where the apparition conveniently disappears instantly. Nope, I stared down with that mother ducker for 6 hours. It saw me, and I saw it. Now, partially, the stare down happened because I froze up with fear. I felt like I was in a trance. Something gripped my attention. I knew it could see me, but I felt that it recognized that I was aware as well. I sank to my knees after about 2 hours. Only the top of my head would have been visible. About 2 minutes after sinking down, it began to slowly move sideways through the tree line. It was almost as if it believed I had given up. The second I popped up, it froze. I tested this theory a few times, and the result was the same. It couldn't make it out of my head, which makes me believe the vision isn't as good as mine is. I also do not think the critical thinking is there, as I ran through the same cycle about 5 times without it picking up. The skinwalkers seem to run on instinct alone, patterning their behaviors based on what they see. The biggest problem they have is that they do not interact with other humans, they simply float along. This makes them easiest to spot once trying to converse with one. They're awkward and clumsy, and again, the reactions don't match. Have you seen somebody fake a laugh? That's how they respond to what they think is a joke, a fake belly laugh. However, they fail to move their eyebrows, squint their eyes, and smile in a similar manner. I discovered my first and only true skinwalker 2 days ago while I was out to lunch. I had stopped to open the door for somebody walking out of a local burger joint. I opened it for them, said, "There you go," and tried to slip in the door. The skinwalker stopped just outside the door and responded with a "you're welcome" and a big toothy grin, like they were smiling for a dentist taking x-rays. The eyes seemed to be bubbly and watery, almost like how I would imagine a caricatured dog's eyes would look. The skin around them was saggy, yet the forehead skin was pulled so tight. I gave an incredulous look, sort of stunned at how awful this thing was. It responded with that god-awful fake belly laugh. The more intense the laugh got, the more freaked out I got. The face itself became almost hazy, like somebody was turning on one of those anonymous filters in front of it. In a split second, the face snapped back to normal, and the thing simply walked off. I don't know, it gives me the creeps with the way the eyes sort of wobbled back and forth. It still makes my hair stand up. I don't want to believe I'm going through this. I don't want to believe that I saw a human-like moose crawling around on all fours, peering from around the side of my shed last night as I took out my trash. I don't want to believe that 5 days ago, a random stranger knocked on my door, asking to borrow a spark plug because his car was out of gas, while holding his hands out in a thumbs-up position. When I told him I couldn't help him, he said adios and just walked away with an ever so slight haze around him. I don't want to believe that I'm hearing the voice of my ex-wife pleading to let her in from the cold as I hear faint tapping on my front door. But let me tell you, it's real. It's all real and happening to me here. This isn't like a video game. I don't have some goddamn progress bar to let me know how close these things are to me. I don't know how much time there is left. They seem close, but nobody is moving in on me yet. Whatever you do, do not say any of this out loud, otherwise, I can assure you, you'll be in a similar situation as me. I'm sitting here typing this up as I can see the skinwalker just sitting on my shed. Waiting. I am waiting for me to finally break. To slip up and open my door the next time, it mimics my grandma's voice. To say its name out loud one more time to strengthen its hold on me. Maybe I'm on a cusp, just far enough gone to where I'll be hunted forever. Maybe they are taking their time to wear me down. I wish I had answers. I only have problems. Fuzzy-faced, emotionally disturbed, mutant moose-sized problems. I just went to my bedroom to get away from the scratching outside my front door. Every window has fog on one of the corners. I'm presuming that one of those things is breathing right outside the window, steaming it up. I can see one of them right now as I sit on my bed. It's sitting with just the top of its eyes and head visible. The eyes are sunken back into the oversized sockets. I can see the veins in the eyeballs glowing a fluorescent blue, highlighting the inflamed red around the eye sockets. The eyebrows are at an odd height up on the forehead, as if they started drifting upwards from their normal location. I can see it sizing me up. I feel like I'm being tasted via the sense of sight. It started whimpering to me in the infant voice of my brother. Let me in, please let me in. I'm freezing out here. How can you just knowingly let me freeze? I'm dying out here. Please just help me. Open the window so I can warm up. Please. And shit like that on repeat. It's really doing a damn good job of driving me insane. I'm half tempted to just open the window and get it over with. These things have been in Navajo culture for thousands of years, probably dating back to the times before paper. How am I supposed to stop something that hasn't been stopped in thousands of years? I'm another statistic. The only hope I have is to eliminate their food supply. Everything starves, right? Maybe by spreading this story, the skinwalkers will start to disappear. Maybe they'll go into hiding or hibernation. I wouldn't count on it, though. They seem to know what they are doing. So for those of you reading this, just be careful. Tonight, tomorrow, next week, next year. I don't know if the skinwalkers pick up on technically transmitted signals. Maybe they don't yet, but at some point they might adapt. So if you hear a tapping at your window tonight, don't turn over in your bed to check it out. If you see steam in the corner of your living room window, don't go out front to check it out. If you hear somebody knocking at your door unexpectedly, take a quick peek first. Pay attention to people's hand motions while talking, their facial expressions, and their reactions. They're out there. They may be after you next. Slowly closing in on your whereabouts, awkwardly bumping into you, and feasting on the nights that you can't sleep. Recently, my boyfriend and I found the fresh remains of an animal at a mountain park, and later on, as we were sitting inside our car, my boyfriend claimed to have seen a tall, white, and skinny humanoid with hollow eyes from his rear view mirror creeping towards him from the truck bed to his driver's side door. We are in a single cab. Obviously spooked, he quickly got us out. Once he had told me what he saw, I was a little reluctant because I didn't see anything, and my windows were rolled down. Unfortunately, from there, it started stalking us in real life and in dreams. My dreams have been very violent, vivid, and lucid, and I was required to fight back. In one of my dreams, I was in my room, and 3 knocks came at my door. I was conscious not to open it, but once I got up to lock it, the thing my boyfriend described came busting in and attempted to pounce on me. I fought back and don't know how. I had thrown it on the ground and it just disappeared, but then later in the dream, I went to talk to my mom, and out of the blue, she pulled a chafed Native American headdress. Then another 3 knocks came to my widow, and I saw this demon-like creature just crouched starting at me. We've been cleansed by a certified Catholic cleanser, but the presence has not gone away. Also, my boyfriend has been hearing the Charo Negro walking around his house and has dreamt of him being dragged by the carriage. He broke free in the dream but said Charo should just keep moving forward. I believed it either attempted to or had attached itself to me because, after cleansing, I was trembling, pale, and cold. I felt weak, as if a part of me had been taken away from me. I was feeling very weak and wanted to give up my life. My boyfriend as well had a feeling of despair. We really don't know what else to do to help. Remains were found at a mountain park spot in the Gainesville area, and the mountain is adjacent to Lake Lanier. We both are clean, no drugs involved. So, I was living down in West Texas in this national park, where the restaurant where I was working at the time rested at the top of a 15-minute hike up a mountain trail from the housing they had us in. I closed up the restaurant after everyone left each night, so I was always an hour or 2 later coming down the hill than everyone else. Usually pretty empty, really quiet, and uncommon to encounter anyone else, as the only thing at the top of the mountain is the closed restaurant, gift shop, store, and some of the trailheads. There isn't much reason for anyone else to be on the trail at that hour. And this one ducking night, I'm coming down, there was no moon, so it was pitch black, empty, and characteristically quiet. I round this last bend to get to my house, and right before I get off the trail to take a shortcut through the thicket of cactus and brush, there were maybe 15 to 20 trees. Even though it's a desert, the top of the mountain has a high Sierra microclimate. I hear my best friend or roommate call out my name, clear as day, in the other direction. He said my name, and when I turned, he said it again. In retrospect, it sounded funny? It was close, maybe 15 yards, but it sounded far off at the same time. Like if someone recorded his voice from far away but played it very nearby. It just sounded off, but not enough to flip a switch immediately. And maybe I'm painting the memory of it differently than it actually sounded. So, I'm facing my house, maybe 50 yards away, and the voice comes from directly to my left. On this foothill of the mountain, we'd hike around sometimes. It has much more tree coverage than the trail I was on, and considerably more than the thicket separating me from the clearing surrounding my house. If you walked 5 feet in the direction the voice came from, you'd completely disappear from the view of anyone on the trail or on the back porch of the house. immediately. So, hearing my friend's voice calling me over, I was like, oh, cool, we're night hiking, and I turned to follow it, but right before I took my first step into the tree line, I heard his actual voice down on our porch saying, "Hey, who are you talking to?" Which stopped me. I turned back to face my house, confused as shit, just in time to see this ducking thing burst out of the ducking thicket I was just about to shortcut through to begin with before hearing the first voice and turning away. And, from the exact spot I had walked down every single night, this ducking thing bolts. It was technically humanoid, but the thing is tall as shit and way too skinny for a human. Like at least 8 feet tall, but slim. It looked inhumanly slender. He was hunched over and running like he just burst off a track mark, you know? But kept that same form the whole time, never getting all the way upright. Okay, so, as for the color, that has always ducked with me, because for one, I'm colorblind as shit, and it was like a greenish/yellow thing, and I get greens and yellows mixed up a lot, this hue of green and yellow, at least. And for two, it looked like it was giving off its own glow, which has always sounded so absolutely ludicrous that I never tell anyone that I do not absolutely trust to give me the benefit of the doubt before thinking that I'm completely bullshitting. Because, if I heard this story, I would honestly think someone at the very least might be a little bit bullshitting. Our back porch light was on, though, and the thing lined up with where it would have been shining, so if this thing was translucent, it definitely could have taken on that sheen by reflecting the porch light. The colors do kind of line up, I guess. If you'd reflected the light, it may have looked like this thing's color, but it certainly wasn't identical. Sincerely, though, I swear it had its own shine to it. Like looking at a glow stick that's dying. More than enough to see, but kind of faint. Regardless, it was a light that definitely wasn't there a second before when I'd gotten to the shortcut. It would have stuck out for the last 50 yards of the walk, at least. It should be noted that had I followed that thing's voice, 2 things would have happened. 1, I would have completely disappeared from the view of anyone, and 2, I would have turned my back on whatever that thing was and entered into a thicket of trees, weeds, and cacti far too dense for me to turn around, run, fight back, or do anything else. And that trail I would have gone toward leads directly to the edge of a cliff that drops down into a massive break in the mountain, the window in Big Bend National Park, that cleanly drops all of the 6.000 feet to the wide open desert below. That could be the purpose of that direction. To be honest, if I were going to try to do some nefarious shit, it would be the perfect place to both find someone and lead them quickly to a spot where no one else would come up on you. In the middle of the day, you could probably make someone disappear over there if you wanted. Anyway, no matter how this thing was running, it immediately felt like a ducking spooked it. Like how a deer runs off at a noise, but this was different in that it seemed a lot more determined. It seemed intelligent, aware of its own movement, and not just acting out of instinct. Kind of like spooking a person if they'd been watching you from the bushes or something, you know? Like, spooked but sentient, and definitely acting like I just foiled some nefarious plan. So, naturally, I also ducking bolt, exposing my back to this thing, but taking the opposite, slightly longer way to my back porch. My ducking buddy, God bless his soul, is still there when I make it, and he asks again, "Who are you with?" His face is just confused as shit, and he keeps looking past me, and I'm like, "You heard it, too, right?" And he says, "Yeah, where are they?" And I was like, What? There were multiple. Apparently, from his perspective, he had heard multiple voices alongside my own, all carrying on and joking around, talking back and forth pretty loudly. He said there were at least 3 other voices talking to mine, but that it sounded like a whole crowd coming down the trail. He said he could clearly hear us getting closer and closer for the past few minutes and just assumed I'd run into a hiking group and talk with them as we headed down, not the most uncommon thing in the daytime, but pretty uncommon for the hour of night. It took me a minute to show him that I wasn't messing with him and had not just split off from a group of hikers. I was completely alone and had not vocalized a word until he called up to ask, "Who are you with?" It took me a second to even express my side of what was going on. I was so out of whack I couldn't find the words to actually explain, so I just kept shouting, "I swear to God, I just heard your voice, and then this ducking thing. Dude. This thing." Or something similar. Eventually, it registers that there were no other lights on the trail. I wasn't using a flashlight that night, so maybe there was actually some moon out, and I had just heard his voice calling me off trail and into the dark, and we both began trying to figure out what the duck we just witnessed. Okay. This part might be a little crazy, but I'm not implying anything, I'm just saying. This is what I'd been doing on the walk down before this happened. So, obviously, walking home solo, I hadn't actually said a word. Whoever he heard was certainly not me, and I certainly didn't come with a crowd. But I had been praying like crazy on the hike down. There had just been this super dark, negative energy in the house lately, and I was just trying to kind of surround myself with light and positivity, asking God to give me strength before I walked back in, and out of nowhere, midway through the trail, I got this, like, absolutely overwhelming joy, like an absolute ecstasy. I was like screaming inside, happy as bones, and just felt like I could take on the whole MF world. Like no matter what came, I could take it. Maybe I am implying something, because call me crazy, but I've always felt like that had something to do with how the night turned out as opposed to how it maybe would have. I know that part really does make me sound insane, but so does the rest of it, so whatever. I certainly don't think it was a coincidence. I'm just not sure what to make of any of it. Every detail means every detail, that's just what was going on with you as the walk was happening. It would have been a noteworthy and memorable night had the thing not done any of this, it was that powerful of an energy. Anyway, that's pretty much it. The only other thing is our memory of it. Out of nowhere, I just sort of stopped thinking of it. Not like I forgot, but like it was hidden behind some thick fog in my head. The next morning, I told the story to a friend, and she uncharacteristically shut me down and just said something like, "Y'all are just crazy and getting scared of these mountains," and I just walked away. It really was not like her to just dismiss someone, especially a friend, without even hearing them out. She was a really empathetic lady. It was legit, like she just heard something that triggered a memory she refused to touch and shut down before it got too close. I could be reading into it. But that's happened a couple of times with this story. And anyway, we'd been living on that mountain off and on for a few years at that point and had never once heard or seen anything remotely similar to that thing. Until that night, we'd never even heard a story even vaguely resembling that. It just wasn't like we got spooked out of our own house or the trail we took twice a day, every day. And it wasn't like we were seeing and hearing things based on stories we'd projected into the darkness, you know? But the weirdest, ducking thing happened the moment she walked away. It was legit, like a ducking fog just slowly poured over the memory, and the last time I remember thinking of it was that moment, and then it just ducking disappeared for months. How in the world does something that massive and frightening happen in your life and you just stop thinking about it? And then one day it just popped the duck back up. I was honestly so surprised and unsure of how I hadn't thought of it in so long. It was almost more baffling than anything we actually witnessed. I asked my friend just before I sent this if he'd felt the same fog thing, and he said, absolutely. He doesn't really like talking about that night, honestly, and he's told me that, but I cannot help but bring it up as often as possible, hoping that by talking it through we'd find some sort of explanation for any of what happened. Even as I typed the message, though, I felt like I'd asked him a million times already and just forgotten his answer. Maybe I have. That isn't a super uncommon thing to do, I guess. To start, I should probably tell you that I am 1/3 Native American. I have always been a bit sensitive to the supernatural. A couple of weeks ago, I worked an odd shift, 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. after work. I decided that I was going to go to the local native reservation for cigarettes and gas. When I had finished getting gas, I was a little bit too tired to drive. I decided to take a nap in the darker corner or the parking lot. I faded off into sleep, and at 4:37 I was awoken by a howl like a wolf, but more like a man mimicking a wolf. I look out front of my car, and there is a wolf-like man, white in color, standing around 50 to 60 feet in front of my car. It slowly walked toward me. I started the car and put it in reverse. I decided to get out of there. As I was leaving, it scratched the trunk of my car. It's been 3 weeks since then, and I am working my normal shift at work from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I have seen it in many places since, and I feel it getting closer to me. I talked to the local native chief, and he says that if it is following me like this, it may be hunting me or that it could be trying to protect me from something more dangerous. He also told me that he could do nothing to help me. I thought I'd share my experience to see if anyone has also experienced something like this or knows what it might have been. As of this day, I can't find anything similar. This happened about a decade ago, when I was a teenager. My family and I moved onto a country property that had a small acreage paddock on the side of the house, bordering on dense bush or forest. No other houses were nearby. Anyway, I would go out at around 9-ish, dark, in the evening to give my horse a last feed, pat and brush, and check that he wasn't cold, etc. He was the first horse I ever had, so I was really fond of hanging out with him. Anyway, for 2 nights in a row, this owl just suddenly turned up and would be sitting on the clothesline, really close to where I would stand with the horse. It would just stare intensely at me the whole time and not fly off, even though I would be literally within inches of it. Not even the huge sensor spotlight on the driveway nearby would freak it out enough to fly off when it would come on and light up the whole house and paddock periodically, depending on where we moved around in that spot. I thought it was peculiar with the owl, but that was about it until now, in hindsight. Anyway, on the third night, it was there again but did eventually fly off halfway through me feeding the horse. I stood there stroking my horse in the glow of the faint interior garage light for about 10 minutes, just taking in the night, when my mom came out from behind me, where the garage side doorway was, to see how I was doing, etc. As we started talking, her 3 chow house and my bull terrier ran out into the middle of the paddock for a sniff. As they ran past the first paddock fence, they set off the sensor spotlight. We kept talking for about a minute when my mom was slightly elevated above me and the horse in the garage looked puzzled over the horse towards the back of the paddock, saying, "What is that?" The paddock, towards the back, became incredibly steep, with our water tank sitting on the high side as it descended down to the other side of the paddock, bush, and road. I must add all my animals, the horse, the dogs, and strangers. If the dogs saw anything suddenly start moving fast out of nowhere, they would definitely chase it and bark at it aggressively. Anyway, I stepped out in front of my horse with my mom and moved towards the fence to see a white figure hunched over beside the water tank as if sussing out the water that had overflowed. At first, from the position it was in, I thought it might be a large kangaroo, Australia, but as me and my mom leaned on the fence to get a closer look with the light shining brightly, it suddenly turned its face over its shoulder and looked at us, realizing we were watching it. In that second, we realized it was a human face, but we were both frozen in shock at what it possibly was. Next it suddenly turned around and went from being this maybe hunched over animal to a giant slender figure, taller than the water tank, 7-foot-ish, shaped like a humanoid or man with a long face, mouth, and eyes, white all over, no hair, and long arms. However, what was really odd was that it was wearing a baggy, huge white t-shirt that hung past its waist. No other clothing. It stared at us for a second, standing straight up, then quickly hunched over low to the ground again and started running down the steep hill across the borderline of the paddock and bush, just like on all fours down the hill except instead of its hands touching the ground, they just went side to side like someone normally running or walking. Even though it was hunched, its back was dead straight at that angle, and its neck and head kept smoothly turning over its shoulder, looking at us as it ran as fast as possible. Even as it disappeared into the bushes, where you couldn't see it, you could still hear it smashing through the bushes. All the while, our dogs didn't bark or acknowledge anything had happened, even though the thing ran right in front of them. Neither did the horse budge to the loud smashing noises of it in the bush. Me and my mom, suffice to say, bolted back into the houses, freaked out at what we had seen. After that, I stopped hanging out at night alone with the horse. The main thing that still gets to me the most about that sighting is the out-of-place t-shirt, how it ran so fast at such an impossible angle against gravity while managing to twist its head at us, and the dogs ignoring it. So my question is, what do you think it might have been, and have you heard or had any similar experiences?